Welcome to End Talkers. My name's Elio Forcheron,
And my name's Daniri Neri.
and today we will be talking about the Sildihn Subterrain.
We sure will.
Bow, 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 bow.
Our first variant dungeon that we ever got.
Yes, and I will say for anyone who's been following the channel for a bit of time or has seen any of our other lore talks, maybe one that we were just a little bit excited for, or at least I was.
No, I definitely was. I was really excited for it.
So yeah, we're going to talk about the setup for the Sildihn Subterrain and then go into talking about maybe the different paths and kind of deep diving into it. I know I actually put out a video where I was initially intending to deep dive the paths hardcore, but honestly that took so much time to produce and for relatively little reward that I think this might be a better format to be tackling the variant and slash criterion dungeons.
I think you're probably right, to be honest. Yeah.
So why don't we talk about variant dungeons as a format maybe before we go on?
What do you think about them?
Well, so I think they are brilliant. It may be no surprise to someone who's a lore nerd. They created a dungeon type that's very specifically for expanding upon the world and the lore. Since Shadowbringers, there's only been one dungeon per patch. It didn't really make sense that they would ever go back to Sil'dihn. This adds a piece of content that people can do. I guess it's not really endgame, but pseudo endgame or later game content that people can do that fleshes out the world, allows them to dive back into old places, and also with the Criterion and Criterion Savage variants as well, it allows for there to be actual like hard endgame content, though they're still figuring out the reward structure. At the time of recording, Aloe has just come out, and I will say the new reward structure of having the glowy tombstone weapons is
I've still not played Aloe yet. I will get around. Well, we will be doing that at some point together, possibly on stream. So that's exciting.
very much so.
I enjoy them. I like their concept. Like you said, we used to have this format where we would have, one MSQ dungeon, and then back in the day, we would have two dungeons that were essentially not about, expanding the universe. They were there for gameplay reasons, really, but they did play that role of expanding the universe. We'd get stuff about Zelfatol or stuff about
Hullbreaker Hard.
Yeah, exactly. And they were each just like these little bombs of expansion for the lore and for the characters as well, mostly for the lore back in the day. And now we just have just the one. So I think Criterion Dungeons fulfill an extremely important role that we didn't have for a while.
Yeah, no, I emphatically agree. And I think just looking at the first three, where we have one for each of the three great continents with Sildihn Subterrain for Othard, Aloe for Ilsabard, and Mount Rotcon for Othard, the amount of potential avenues for them to go down is huge. Just even in Eorzea proper, we have places like they could do a Nimian one, they could do a Gelmorian one, like actually going to Northern Gridania. I'm sure I have a list around here somewhere of all the different ones that they could do. But I mean, hell, Ogomoro, northern part of Vilbrin would be great.
Yeah.
The Far Reach, on and on and on. So it's definitely a very exciting format. And if we're getting at least 3 per expansion, if they follow the current cadence, it definitely bodes well.
I think it bodes really well, yeah. I think it's a really important niche, like I said, that we hadn't had. I don't necessarily know if I think that Rokan was as successful in the role that we're describing here as the first Sildihn Subterrain certainly was, and as maybe, from what I've heard, Aloe has also been, especially for a lot of fall players.
Yeah, it's interesting. We'll definitely dive into this. I have a lot of mentions in my notes about this with Sildihn Subterrain, but what's fascinating about all three, arguably, is that they simultaneously teach us very little in terms of revelations that you couldn't have been aware of if you didn't know the lore already, but it condenses it and collates it, and then also there's a lot of little details. Just as an example, as we get further into talking about the Sildihn Subterrain, the fact that Ul'dah and the Amalja worked together to fight the undead in Sil'dihn was not something that was unknown. It was in Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1. The deaths of Nanamo's parents being suspect, the fate of Sil'dihn and the Traitor Spurn. And it's not like the Traitor Spurn was revealed to be a thing in the variant dungeon. So it's like the variant dungeons are interesting because they simultaneously really expound and expand upon things we already know and fill in a lot of little cracks and add in new things like, for instance, Silky or the Guardians that we'll see in here. But there isn't, at least as far as I can think of, necessarily a lot that's revelatory. I think Alo Alo might be the closest just because of how much we didn't know anything about the state of the South Sea Isles.
And sometimes, maybe even usually, what I want isn't the big revelations, it's the padding out of what we know, the filling out of the details and stuff like that, which I think Subterrain does really well.
I emphatically agree. Okay, moving on. Let's go into the information around the Sildihn Subterrain that might be useful to know before you might have entered it. I know a lot of this we've probably already covered in our History of Thanalan lore talk that you're more than welcome to, where we go into a much deeper dive on the timeline. But why don't we give a cursory overview?
Okay, so the origins of this sort of cultural legacy, we can trace it back a little bit further if you want to Alo Alo actually, but we can really begin to look at this story as starting in Mark, the originally underdog of the Eorzean continent in the 5th Astral Era, and then the great belligerent empire that used Void Scent to fight its wars.
Yeah, and very importantly, long history of thaumaturgy and black magic. So that definitely becomes relevant later to Ul'dah and Sildihn and even into the dungeon. Obviously, you have the War of the Magi. The 5th Astral Era comes to a close when the 6th Emerald Calamity, the Floodwaters happen. You get the miqo'te that end up leaving the Fame. And eventually, some end up in Thanalan, about 700 years into the 6th Astral Era. They end up founding Belladia, which also is very important to our story. And you may have seen some of their ruins both around Thanalan and in places like Karn.
Yeah, and magic is really woven into the very beginning of this story. We know that the founding of Belladia happened because they used somehow thaumaturgy to find a water source. They could maybe feel the water aether or something like that. But we do see almost a transformation that, like Elio said, we will see going into this dungeon, where the black magics of Mark are pretty much abandoned, and the thaumaturgy almost, well, it certainly continues, it almost morphs into something associated with craft and with material substance.
Yeah, it's funny how the arcane and the material world definitely are more integrated into each other. And I think you see that some with Belladia, but you even most firmly maybe see that with Ul'dah. And maybe that's best represented by their symbol, right? The Flame of Magic and the Gem of Affluence.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do see the starts of this in Mark. If you're doing the Mark raid, the Alliance raid, there's that big white face made out of stone. We sort of get the implication that that is the beginning of this sort of trend, but it really blossoms under Belladia.
So yeah, one of the important things to really touch on is that the creation of Soulkin starts in Mach, and you will see it in Karn with Belladia. You will see it in Ul'dah. Even you'll see with golems around. You see it very much as we go throughout the Sildihn Subterrain. One of the funny things is that it seems that the miqo'te creation of Soulkin is actually mainly rooted in them learning magics from Amdapor. So it's funny how it all ended up coming far way around.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a really interesting story to tell that I'm sure that we'll discuss about how the Uldahns and the Sildihn seem to have taken different aspects of the craftsmanship and of the imbuement of magic in Soulkin. They've taken it in different directions. They're like branched out a little bit.
For sure. But moving forward, Belladia exists for a while. Funny, for having such a large impact, it only existed for a couple hundred years. And then towards the end of the 10th century of the 6th Astral Era, it split into two, into Ul'dah and Sildihn, due to two princes who couldn't get along, two brothers. And then there's tension. It's not great, but things kind of hold for a while until there's the King of Springs, who ends up ascending the throne in Sildihn and basically diverts all the water sources that Ul'dah is using for their own use, which might be somewhat ironic with the Sildihn aqueducts as a whole, as we see later.
Yes, and I think it's really interesting to look at how control of water is, of course, important to any civilization. Thanalan, it's a desert, it's crucial, but it seems to be a position of prestige in the Belladian legacy. Belladia is founded by gaining control of water. Sildihn establishes dominance by taking control of water, and then Ul'dah cements its legacy by taking that control back.
And yeah, like you say, water is the lifeblood. I mean, look, it's a desert, right? But even throughout the Sildihn Subterrain, right, every route deals heavily in it. But that same water issue effectively comes to a head when there's a drought, and that helps begin the War of the Sisters, which is a war between Ul'dah and Sildihn, which is pretty heated for a couple of years. But you have the Traitor sperm gets created, which is an alchemical concoction created by Ul'dah in order to basically turn people into zombies. And they release that into Sildihn, and the entire populace gets zombified.
Yeah, and the description is extremely dark. You know, when we hear about the Traitor sperm, we hear about, I believe that I'm recollecting this correctly, we hear about corpses infected with it being flung over the walls of Sildihn with catapults, which of course is a real life historical tactic that was used with the plague. For example, you would fling infected bodies into a city.
Straight biological warfare.
Yeah, absolutely. And this just, it seems to, from all the evidence we have, just instantly destroy Sildihn. Like in a matter of maybe days at the most, Sildihn just collapses.
I mean, when half of your populace is turning into zombies overnight, and then the rest of the half follows swiftly after, it's not exactly surprising that everything goes to shit with relative quickness. What also makes sense is it wasn't just like a undead plague, it was a zombie plague if you think about it. We get with the emulsion boss in the right route that it is communicable. So imagine being trapped in the city, your city, with a bunch of other people who are effectively going to be spreading it to you.
Classic zombie sort of scenario. And it's another thing that's really interesting because these, especially Beladiah / the proto-Beladian state that we have some sort of evidence of, maybe, or even just a pre-Fifth Astral Era state there in the desert, they also seem to put a lot of emphasis on life after death, on Ashkin. You know, you will see, for example, in Khan, and these are Beladian enemies that we're fighting here, but Khan predates Beladiah. You know, there are the mummies that can transfer and sort of inflict undeath on other people as well. Now, I don't think there's a direct link there, but it's sort of an interesting cultural thread to follow.
Yeah, there's definitely a veneration of some sort for the dead that we see. I mean, even Ul'dah is, in terms of locations in game, the most closely linked with that. I mean, think about it in the story. When you go to a graveyard, it's in Ul'dah, and then you have the ossuaries and all that. It is something that I think is a long line throughout the entire history of the Thanalan cultures. I mean, hell, even the Amalja do.
Yeah, and Nal Tal are the gods of the underworld.
Right. So we have Baldr Thorne, who ascends the throne, ending the first Ul Dynasty, because he finds out what happened with the Traitor Spurn, which is an important moment. And then also just as importantly, and it's something that I think a lot of people forget, is that Ul'dah is relocated on top of the ruins of Sildihn. So at this point, Sildihn has been wrecked and somewhat covered by the desert sands, and Ul'dah goes like, you know what might be nice? Putting our capital right on top of a zombie-infested nightmare land.
Yeah. And it's interesting, we don't know specifically, to my knowledge, where Ul'dah was. We don't know where Uldah's original site was located, do we?
No, and the other weird thing is that Encyclopedia Eorzean Volume 1 comments that circa 1100s, basically, a permanent coliseum is erected as a gladiatorial culture becomes finally entrenched in Ul'dah. And I always would have assumed that was like the Blood Sands, but it can't be because Ul'dah moves. But we don't find any examples of like a ruin with an entire, gladiatorial coliseum or anywhere else in Thanalan. So I have to wonder, where were the original remnants of the old Ul'dah?
It can't be Halatali, although that is a very ancient sort of site for this. Even back to the Marquis, it seems to have been somewhat important, maybe. But that was only transformed into a gladiatorial sort of arena and training ground very recently, around the Blood Sands sort of founding, maybe a little bit after even.
Yeah, and while those caves were used by the Maquis, like you were getting at, when they first arrived in Thanalan, if there's an entire city nestled within, I think we would know.
Yeah. I think the impression that I've always gotten is that it's somewhere in the Sigoli, maybe, because I can't imagine where else it would be.
I think you're probably right. And in 1.0, there was the Mirage of Beladiah out in the Sigoli, so short of that, I can only think of places maybe in northern Thanalan, but then you'd think that all the cerulean deposits would have been more of note.
Right, exactly.
And for those of you wondering about if it's some of the ruins you see dotting the landscape in places like western and eastern Thanalan, those are actually date back to Beladiah rather than to the original Ul'dah.
Yeah, and like Elliot said, we can look at the material evidence. So there's no Colosseum. There's nothing of that sort of size, necessarily. We don't even have the ruins of the Beladian capital firmly established, so it's really just quite hard to tell.
But we have another important event that happens around this time, roughly, which is the Hecaton Kyrie's uprising in Copperbell. So you have Baldriff Thorne and the Thorne Dynasty, who uses mind control devices on a bunch of what are effectively giants, the Hecaton Kyries. They are made to do slave labor in the Copperbell mines, and then eventually they say, heck no, try to break free, and they are trapped underground. And important for a certain mini-boss that we see throughout the three routes.
Yeah, so the Hecaton Kyries are bought from, if you go to the Crystal Tower and you look at the Gygas that are around that, they actually sold the Hecaton Kyries, who are sort of a subspecies of their species, to the Thorne Dynasty. And the Thorns have this sort of weird, twisted morality going on with them, because they, and we'll touch on this more later, but they very willingly hand the throne back when they believe the old dynasty is ready to have it back. But then they do some pretty messed up stuff, like the desecration of corpses, which we'll also see later on in this, with the secret boss, and the enslavement of the Hecaton Kyries, and of course the Little Ladies Day lore as well. So they're sort of dark and light at the same time.
It is really interesting. They're literally, even in the notes for the Sildihn Subterrain, described as honest and have integrity. So they're described with like positive attributions, despite some of the more questionable, almost heinous things that they do. Or I shouldn't say almost. I mean, enslavement is heinous.
Yeah, enslavement and then sealing them underground to die in horrible darkness.
Yeah. So the Hecaton Kyries and all of that happens about 100 years after the Traitor Spurn. And then about another, let's just shy of another 100 years after that, undead start pouring out of Sil'dihn in the ruins beneath Ul'dah, and the Emalja and the Ul'dah team up in order to fight them back.
And I think we should also note the ruins below Ul'dah. It's not that Sil'dihn was subterranean in its entirety. It's just that, you know, the parts overground were already cleansed of the zombies by the, I think even before the Thorne Dynasty took over. And the subterranean, although obviously it proves there was significant infrastructure under the ground in Sil'dihn, we do get the impression that the main city was still above ground.
Yeah, it's hard to know for sure, because you have the whole Quarter of Rule that exists, which you would presume the throne room wouldn't have not necessarily been buried that deep, but it's also quite possible that, I mean, you're talking about the better part of 600 years. A lot could have changed the landscape, not least of all the fact that we've had the calamity in the time between. Look, the entire Crystal Tower sprung up from beneath the ground. Like, anything's possible.
Yes, absolutely. And not to harp back on my Khan again, you know I love my archaeology and stuff, but so the Quarter of Rule is really interesting because we see the heart of Khan, which is both a sort of an administrative for the priesthood center, and also it seems to be the main judicial center for Beledaya. Like, that's where criminals are sentenced and executed. So there's almost this like habit of building them underground a little bit, maybe. But it's also possible that with, you know, like with certain American cities, it was just built on top of and essentially became underground.
Yeah, I think one of the things that also kind of helps support some of what we're saying too is that the Springs Passage is technically speaking open to the light and the sky. Like, if you look at Ul'dah, for instance, Ul'dah is actually kind of built on already a mound of earth and on a, not really a cliff edge, but like it's already built on an elevated piece of land. So you can imagine at one point if it had either dipped at all or that if the surrounding land elevation had been slightly lower, the Sil'dihn could have existed in a much more clear basin in the central Thanalan. But we're already doing the thing where we're going in far deeper than we need to. So just keep us moving along. I do really want to get back on to the Emalja and the Ul'dah teaming up. I think it's going to be very, very important to talk about throughout, but also especially in Route 3. But it is something that the Syndicate definitely tried to omit from history, and a lot of people tried to keep from being known because it was much more expedient to other the Beast tribes. Also, for that whole rigmarole and history, I welcome you to check out our other lore talk on Beast tribes throughout the history, on tribal groups, and how the entire notion of Beastmen is a complete bullshit lie and doesn't even really make sense.
Yeah, it's completely manufactured by, specifically in Origin, although most other groups in at least Eorzea seem to have perpetrated it as well, but definitely begun by the Syndicate in order to establish their wealth better, which is pretty much the motivation for everything they do.
Racism is not endemic to Ul'dah, however, they were the first to codify into law. Like, a confrontation between the Ixali and Kobolds and Limsons, for instance, like, it has existed for just as long, if not longer. So it's not exclusive to Ul'dah, but they were the first to codify into law.
Basically, yeah. The Amalja, as we learn, fought very heroically in the protection of, well, not necessarily the protection of Ul'dah, but the protection of the shared land they live in.
Yeah, their shared home, right? And I think that's the most important part. So they together defeat the undead after a couple years, and then the Thorne Dynasty ends. They basically defeat the undead in the Sildihn Subterrain, and they're like, you know what? Now's a good time to give it all back to the Ul Dynasty. So that's when the second Ul Dynasty begins. And then nothing really happens for about 200 years until we get to Nanamo. Basically, she's born, and then when she's 5 years old, her parents die in an accident. Definitely an accident that was definitely not perpetrated by the Syndicate as a means to prevent them from taking a lot of the truths of Amalja working with the Ul'dah, because that was a fact that most people had forgotten, and it very much helped the Syndicate that conflict it was existing. But yeah, her parents were definitely not killed in an accident when she was 5 years old, and I feel like people forget that about Nanamo, that she like inherited her role as Sultana at 5.
And this is a really important, although the power of the Syndicate was already very, very powerful by the time of her father, but the death of the adult rulers of Ul'dah and the fact that a regency needed to be formed, and the regency, by the way, entirely formed with the Syndicate, to rule in her place for several years, is a great reason for why, by the time that we get to Ul'dah, she's almost entirely ceremonial in reality.
Yeah, and that only begins to shift, obviously, when she tries to take advantage of her power and play the political game. If you've played the MSQ, you know. Honestly, the fact that she's not more of a figurehead with the role that she's had and plight that she's gone through is kind of surprising. I guess you could probably partly chalk that up to Rabban. Although, to be fair, she didn't have Rabban join her till later on.
Yeah, it seems like Rabban was definitely a turning point, and then Nanamo was able to build on that herself. So we can't give all the credit to Rabban, we never would, but there is absolutely, a contribution.
Yeah. Okay, 30 minutes into this conversation, are we ready to actually start talking about the Sildihn Subterrain itself?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, one of the things I want to talk about is actually the Sildihn Subterrane's exterior, rather than talking about its interior. To start with, mostly because the Sildihn Subterrane is, well, we've had an entrance to it in Central Thanalan for forever. I'm sure me and you even speculated. I think me and you even have joked about it in recordings in the past about having dungeons there.
I think that is entirely possible, yes.
And what's fascinating about that is that it's such a good example of what I'm talking about, where there's places all throughout the world that could be deeply explored. But one other thing I like about that is that there's some storytelling being told, but the fact that the entrance is surrounded by Spriggans, but also during the story, it's got a bunch of golems around it. So there is this kind of idea of Sul'dihn being close to and surrounding the ruins of Sildihn. And obviously, if any of you have played patch 2.55, you know that the Subterrain and the tunnels around it and Ul'dah are of major import, let's say, as we escape from a certain banquet.
Yeah, this is where we emerge, isn't it?
Yes. We emerge from this very place. But I also love that they use those events in 2.55 to kind of justify how they ended up finding the entrance into this part of the Subterrain, because the cave-in that comes from our whole escapades down there actually helped lead to this discovery. Which also is kind of why I like the justification for why variant dungeons as a format only makes sense to exist now, starting kind of at the end of the first part of our adventure, where there's so many parts of the world that we've been to, it's now time to dig deeper into them.
Yeah, 100%. It's a very convenient explanation for it, of course, but then, me and you have been, I wouldn't say calling, maybe sounds a bit aggressive, but we've been looking for the chance to explore this kind of thing after the end of, well, I shouldn't say the end because it came during, but, after we dealt with the Endsinger.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay. Heading on into said ruins, we end up in this little entryway past a flowery door into the Threshold 3. I mean, there's not a ton to remark on with this area, but one of the things I do love is it kind of introduces that idea of 3 paths lay before you, choose whichever you like.
Yeah, the design of it is, well, perhaps not massively innovative on a general scale, although obviously it is for 14. It lends itself really well to the sort of the system of discovering the different notes and piecing the story together over time. If you haven't done that, by the way, like if you haven't gone through and played it, then I recommend at least looking the notes up. It's a really interesting read. Obviously, we'll discuss them in here, but
Okay, shall we move on into one of the first major sections, which is the irrigation ducts?
yes.
So I was not necessarily expecting just how much infrastructure was going to be existent down here, because the amount of infrastructure around water and the mass spread of it, I mean, I guess clearly in this case for irrigation, but also for the whole aqueducts, basically, is kind of stark and impressive. It's really in contrast to what we see above ground, which I realize this is Endwalker era design, whereas ARR had to be a little bit more limited in scope. But these tubes be enormous.
They really are, and it's almost a further indication of how advanced. Although Uldar certainly will become very mechanically advanced and very advanced in craft, and especially with finer small things. It seems like where they took the craftsmanship and the magic of Belladaya and made it sort of small, they did jewel crafting and they had mammoths instead of golems and stuff like that. Sildihn seems to have taken it and made it macro. They've got these huge tunnels, they've got the golems still, they retained these sort of massive, we'll see that certainly later on, they retain these sort of massive defenders. So, like I said, it's these branching paths again between the two of them.
Yeah, and I feel like there's two fascinating things to talk about there. One of which is the level of almost Nimian engineering going on here with some of the mechanisms that we see throughout. I have to say, there's a couple of notes that kind of imply there's a certain amount of like urban planning that we know Uldar did using what existed already, that Sildihn had already made. But I have to wonder how much of the stuff down here is Sildihn or Uldan origin, because I wonder if there is any infrastructure down here that is more Uldan. It's hard to say, and the fact that so much of it is corroded makes me assume that, that a lot of this has been sectioned off for so long, makes me assume that it's mostly Sildihn. However, at some point, presumably when they were building Ul'dah atop the ruins, they had to have built some of their own infrastructure, right?
Yeah, I do wonder about that myself. It seems almost difficult to imagine that the Syndicate wouldn't want to use this kind of infrastructure. Perhaps they replicated it to a certain degree because it is just in terrible condition, most of it. So it would be, the Syndicate's callous, but they're not stupid necessarily. They're not going to let their water infrastructure, break down.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, if there's one thing you can trust them, it's that they're going to be effective with anything that involves money or efficient use of power or city planning, frankly. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's hard for me to tell. It also may just be that there's not really anyone, that it is Ul'dan, but there's just no way for anyone to really come repair it or work on it, because while there's hinted to be at least one other entrance into this area, because we have the thief that ends up in the Royal Throne Room area, and who also then in the Malachite Portico, may just be that no one's been able to service it.
Yeah, I think that's possible. My personal read is that this is Sildihn, in origin at least.
Yeah. One of the other things is that we got the creatures that are here. In the first little part of this, is not really anything that interesting. It's mostly things like bats and Ergonites. I guess one thing I would say that's interesting about the Ergonites is, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly, make fun of me in the comments if you like. The main place that I can remember seeing them in Eorzea at least is in Vilbrin, in places like Bronze Lake. So the fact that some of them ended up here, I mean, look, there's plenty of ability for things to end up in all sorts of weird places, and maybe there are some in Western Thanalan, for instance, but it is interesting to see kind of almost the variety of life that we end up seeing throughout the Subterrain, and I don't wonder if that's indicative of life that's been able to be safe down here and secured away, or if there's actually more to it.
Well, the interesting thing is that one of the few notes of lore that we do have about the Ergonites specifically is that they were a beloved food of the Nimians. So that's why we see so many around Bronze Lake. We do also, I will say, and we know there's a connection between these two caves somewhere, which we'll get into later. We do find them in Copperbell.
Oh, right. They're in that whole area in the back. Oh, okay. You know what? I like that. That's very relevant. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Of course. Okay. Shall we move on to the next part?
Yes. Yeah, let's go.
So we've got a nice little hallway with Nanamo following us the whole time, obviously. And in that hallway, we get our first, I don't want to say weird enemy, but we get our first pudding. And the void scent that we end up seeing here are very interesting. We see a lot of void scent, soulkin, ashkin, and I almost say beastkin, but more like wavekin most of the time. Wavekin and seakin. But I do think that the variety is very telling, and a lot of thought has been put into what ends up being in here.
So, like we said earlier, there's the ecological sort of link between Copperbell and between this place, and then the fact that there are puddings here. Now, for puddings, that could just be the presence of corpses. We know that they develop into puddings naturally. Well, I wouldn't say naturally, but you know what I mean. And then for some of the other Void Scent, though, are quite interesting, I think, when we find them. There is this sort of association between death and traumatic events and the sort of humors of dead bodies and creating some of the more basic voidkin, but also soulkin.
Yeah, very much so. And it is worth pointing out that they are voidsent, right? They're distinct from slimes, which are ashkin. Also, in case anyone doesn't know, flan and pudding are used interchangeably as names for this enemy. I mean, sometimes if there's multiple versions of it in a game, they'll use it. They'll like have one specifically denote something. But they've been called both throughout the history of Final Fantasy.
Yeah, generally speaking, flan, pudding. There's even some more niche ones, but yeah, these are the sort of names for them.
Moving forward, we get to another even larger chamber carrying. I mean, I remember first hitting this and just seeing kind of the height of the ceiling and the scope of this area. I really appreciated that as a player. I know the Silly Subterrain, I think for a lot of people, is maybe not aesthetically their favorite of the variant dungeons, with Alo Alo being a beautiful, picturesque Hawaii island and Mount Rokon being literally just some parts of Japan. Like, just, dude, I will say that, oh man, Mount Rokon is gorgeous, but I will say it does just like, I have been to parts of Japan that just look like that. Like, it just straight, like, it's not even fantastical. It's just like, yep, that's Japan in fall.
Yeah, it's a really interesting sort of look at it for me, because for me, it's more architecturally dense. You can pick up on more hints through the architecture. So that's my complete favorite thing to have. So while I understand it's not always the prettiest, if you look at some of the pictures of it, for example, like we've got up now, some of the brickwork is maybe a little repetitive, just like tiled textures over and over again. But I think when you're running through it and you get sort of just a little glimpse, it's pretty enough, I think. And where it's not pretty, it's interesting, maybe.
Yeah, I feel like that was exactly where I was about to get at, which is that if it's not where it's not pretty, it's interesting. And I think more often than not, or at least for me personally with variant dungeons, I care more about them being interesting than pretty. There's plenty of pretty stuff in the game, and there's plenty of interesting stuff in the game, but I'd much rather have the density of information. And to be fair, I mean, not to say that the others don't, but there's a lot more of the natural world in the other two, which I think can tell you less than giving more environmental details.
I agree. I definitely.
We've got a bunch of mosslings, which just remind me of moss balls that we see. I mean, it's basically just more wavekin and leafkin. Not a lot to say. Or seedkin, not leafkin. We do have leafkin later, though. But we do here get our first choice in how we can change the fight coming up, which is to redirect the flow of water via this mechanism.
So, and obviously this changes the mechanics of the later boss fight, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it just goes back to this continual theme of water and of even like hydraulics, I would go so far as to say.
I mean, and if you want to get overly poetic, we could, and maybe reaching a bit, there is this kind of theme of like cleansing the past, of, letting the water flow in the Sildihn Royal part, understanding the past as well as in the right path. It's kind of like of cleansing and understanding are your two like strongest tools.
Yes, yeah, and the format really lends itself to experimenting almost, and to figuring out different routes that you can go, figuring out how to tweak those routes slightly.
Yeah, and I think they've definitely been working on improving their design around it. I don't know how much we'll talk about all things mechanically, but it is definitely at least worth noting this introduction of changing things up, because I think this is really an incarnation of what they kind of wanted old versions of dungeons to be. For those who weren't around in the earlier days, or at least even like before 6.0, dungeons like Copperbell and a lot of the other dungeons, a lot of early dungeons had a design that was attempting to have aspects to them that were a little bit more puzzly, but they never ended up panning out perfectly, in part because, well, to be frank, once you understood what to do, wasn't fun or interesting to do it again because there wasn't like any variety, and all it did was slow down your dungeon runs. And I mean, look, getting a bunch of the second boss in Copperbell Mine, the slime boy. I mean, if you know, you know.
I have probably spent hours waiting for that blasting camp to recharge.
Lordy. But yeah, moving on, we head down the pipe, the broken pipe, and get into the silt pump. And we will see the silt pump, the sifting site, and the settling basin as basically, I don't want to say mirrors, but effectively mirrors of each other with basically a fundamental mechanical difference. In the silt pump, you have basically either the silt or the water flowing through as part of the mechanics. Sifting site, you obviously have the wind and all of that. And then in the settling basin, there's more like the deep water pools. But what is really important and interesting here is Geryon the Steer, which is a fascinating inclusion.
And the triple triad card for Geryon is very illuminating. It basically explains his story. It doesn't necessarily explain how it works, though, which is interesting. So what it basically lays out about Geryon is that he is a descendant of the Hecatonchires. So probably one of the ones that was, born underground. And then he set out to found his own kingdom and somehow made his way. It must be through the same sort of caves that the Eregnites made their way through, and sort of came here to found his own Hecatonchires kingdom, I suppose. Unusually, because he's alone, but work, I guess.
Yeah, it is worth pointing out that this is the left path of the Sildihn Subterrain, so you'd be going west, and if you literally go west from the Sildihn excavation site, you would go directly to Copperbell. I mean, obviously, there's the other paths that he shows up in too, but the excavation site is incredibly close to the Copperbell mines, so the fact that there's some way that he ended up in here through, we know that the Hecatonchires have been tunneling for hundreds of years and been have all sorts of channels all throughout the land below Copperbell. It's not shocking that he ended up here, but it is fascinating, especially that he's alone.
It is definitely fascinating. I would have expected to see maybe a few more with him, but it's just really cool to have him here. It's cool to have a new model for the Hecatonchires as well. Except for the final boss, which is shared between normal mode and hard mode for Copperbell. You just generally get the generic helmet ones. And of course, Geryon is named for a giant of Greek myth, like all of the Hecatonchires are.
I mean, even literally their race name.
Yes.
I do have to wonder if at some point there was plans to have more Hecatonchires as an enemy type in the, somewhere in, the Spring Passage or something. Do you have any thoughts on why? I mean, on a mechanical level, I understand the idea of having the mini boss, the midpoint boss, being basically the same boss with the slight environmental variant between the three. But do you have any idea, from a reconciling him existing in three places at once perspective, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, from my standpoint, I assume that it's just wherever passage you're going down is effectively the canonical, you went down that passage and he showed up at that moment.
Yeah, that's what I would assume. Yeah, I would assume that he has some degree of movement around this area. He obviously has some understanding of the mechanics of the area, so he can probably move around, and it just so happens that either he's heading us off, we're there somehow, or we just so happen to find him there.
Yeah, it's and what you're saying about his local environment, I also do want to touch on the fact that it is look, not enough that they just have infrastructure for the spreading of water, but an entire infrastructure for dealing with pumping out silt, as well as there's a whole water effectively purification system here to be able to feed the entire city, which also does help explain kind of Uldah's ability to thrive in the Thanalan desert, despite it being a pretty vibrant place.
Yeah, absolutely. We have the knowledge of Uldah having well springs and stuff like that, but it's so enormous, and it's so there are some rivers near it, but still, the fact that it's so big, and the fact that its satellite settlements are so big, it's almost like, how did they survive? But if this exists underneath it, if they have some access to it, which I suspect they do to some degree, or a version of it, then that would make a lot more sense.
Yeah. Oh, one thing I did want to note from an earlier point that we were talking about in terms of what was Sil'dihn and what was Uldan. We, throughout the multiple rooms, including especially this room, we see purple bands across the wall. And purple and silver being, I mean, not that there's anything silver here, but purple is specifically being very closely associated with Sildihn makes me think that this is area, at least these areas should be presumed to be theirs in terms architecturally and in origin. And also just the decrepitness of some of the other stonework makes me think that that would have definitely taken time.
Yeah, and the use of the color purple is interesting because it's a color obviously associated with royalty, dating back
And
to the Roman
grapes.
Empire. And grapes, yeah, that's true. Obviously, this comes from Tyrian purple, which is a specific purple dye that was farmed by people in North Africa, originally Carthaginians and other Punic peoples.
Is that the snail one?
Yeah, made out of snail shells, and was extraordinarily lucrative, even up to like the early modern age. And there are still people making it now in sort of Morocco and Algeria. But yeah, it's this exceptionally valuable dye that then goes on to define sort of royalty in power in the Roman Empire and even in the Eastern Roman Empire up until that falls. The phrase born to the purple or born in the purple or porphyrius is used sort of in historical literature to describe being born in an imperial or even a royal family.
Niniri with the etymology for the win. But yeah, no, it is really interesting that the regality of that and kind of yet more the reflections between the sisters.
Right, exactly. And it does invoke, like you were saying about the Chamber of Rule, that this, there is obviously a sort of a monarchical association with this area. Even with the water stuff. And I wonder if that dates back to just how important water is in the culture, that maybe having this stamp of a royal family, if that is what it is, we can't say it is, but it might be.
I was about to say, it goes along with your whole point about water and its importance, not just in a practical sense, but in a symbolic sense.
Right, exactly.
Well, moving on into the Springs Passage, we've got a place where things divert, and one passage is kind of interesting, but the other side is, I think, more interesting with its fruits. However, I do just want to point out this breaking out onto the surface and seeing the sun shine down from above is very pretty. Or at least I find these sort of ruins very pretty.
I think it's sort of a classic, always hits, always is right in Thanalan when they do it. They love to do this. It happens in Cutter's Cry, it happens in Khan, it happens in various places, and it's always, sort of a classic. It always hits really well. It's always really beautiful.
It's also interesting to me that this entire place hasn't filled up with sand with it being open to the sky, which makes me assume that the top area is at least somewhat protected. We can't get a perfect view of it, but the top area is at least somewhat protected by some of the rubble.
I'm honestly surprised that we haven't had the big Myrmidon ants move into this place, because it seems like pre-excavated, like perfect place for them with how much they like. If you look at the left route, it's basically just the same structure with these holes that sort of drift down. Maybe it's too wet for them.
It is only a stone's throw from Cutter's Cry too.
Yeah, exactly. I almost wonder if it's part of the same area, and that's why people haven't found it from the top yet, or at least maybe that's how the thief got in, maybe not. But it's interesting. Maybe the fact, like, people are like, oh, I'm not going to go near holes in this region because there's big giant ants that eat people. So maybe that's how it got left.
A good question, because I mean, we take it for granted as players that because we have flight, that it's like, okay, flying over things is easy. We see that all the time. Most people in Eorzea don't fly places. Like, most people don't travel even as much as we do, but most don't fly, and if they do fly, they're flying on chartered airships that are traveling specific set courses. But you'd think at least one of them would have flown over this area at some point and noticed the giant holes and ruins beneath.
Yeah. I wonder if the monetarists didn't allow flight routes over this area.
I don't know that they necessarily had an awareness of it, but I could imagine that with the Sultanate protected it for most of its history. And then hear me out. Most of the history of flight exists only within the past, not even real century. If the Sultanate was protecting it from anything flying over it, and also there weren't a lot of things flying over it, and then don't forget, once the Garlean invasion happens in 1557, 1562, the airships were being shot out of the sky for a long period of time. So like flying on airships wasn't a thing for quite a couple of years there. So at least in recent times, there's been people have been afraid to necessarily fly over it until the past 5 years, and most people were rebuilding. And also, don't forget that from most people's perspective, after the calamity, all sorts of ruins were being uncovered, and so people had a whole like bevy of things to search through.
Yeah, and we see, for example, that the major routes of travel to Thanalan for almost everybody is you sail into Western Thanalan on a ship, and then there's major caravans around. So much of their stuff is rooted in ground travel and in sea travel that maybe it just avoided notice. Well, it's possible.
Could be. I would also bet too, if you look at the difference between this area and some of the other areas in game, or not in game, but the other in the Sildihn Subterrain, I bet you the height of another one of the paths, like the middle path, actually maps pretty closely to the top of this, which would make sense then that maybe the top of the like Sildihn throne room in the ruler's quarter is actually closer to the surface than you might think, and then you might have an impression because it seems so sealed off.
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. And the fact that it's, the structure that it was, I'm assuming that it maybe was on the surface at one point, possibly.
Mm-hmm. Okay, flying forward, we get a whole bunch of fruits. These things are weird and interesting and look kind of like giant blueberries.
They do look a lot like giant blueberries. And fruits occupy quite an important part in Belladine culture, at least, and then also in the successor cultures. They are associated in Belladaya. Are they associated with knowledge, I believe? Is that what we find out in Khan?
Yes, yep, fruit of knowledge.
Yes. And then in Uldar, the grapes are associated with, is it wealth?
I think so. I know it's Gem of Affluence, Flame of Magic, Helm of Might. In Sildihn, it's still the Grapes of Knowledge. If I'm not mistaken, they have a book on it. Or one of the notes talks about it, and it says that they specifically call it the Grapes of Knowledge.
Yes, which is an evolution, of course, of the the more generally titled Fruit of Knowledge from Belladaya. We actually talk a little bit about obviously we don't have the evidence in that lore talk that we do here, but in the Thanalan lore talks we discuss how these symbols seem to transmute and change once they reach Uldar and Sildihn.
Yeah, I do love the idea though how they split them up, and I have to wonder. It's funny to me. I do wonder with on the lore building side, did they build Karn and just think, okay, wait, we need 4 symbols in total, and so they just randomly assigned 2 to like Sildihn? Or I guess technically speaking, the flame and the gem symbol for the flames was already in existence. So I guess that's probably not how that worked out. But I do love the idea that they had a mechanical problem and then backfitted that into the lore, which I'm sure has happened numerous times.
I don't doubt that, but you never know because Koji did love this sort of stuff.
Yeah,
and there could even be a forum post that clarifies this. There's some really insanely informative old forum posts made by Koji that just sort of cover topics that haven't been covered before.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Gridanian aristocracy. You can learn a lot more about that if you go into the old forums. But it's interesting to see how Sildihn took the fruit of knowledge or the grapes of knowledge, and Uldar took the flame of might. Flame of might.
Flame of magic.
I think it was Flame of Magic in Belladaya, but if I'm looking at EE1, they call it the Flame of Might.
Oh my god. It keeps throwing me off that they do change it that way. Okay. Yeah. Well, either way, it's one of those, and I'm sure we'll get corrected one way or another. But you all understand what we're referring to.
Yeah. But I think it represents this sort of... Maybe Sildihn was almost a technological powerhouse, while Uldar became at least a military powerhouse. There's almost this clashing ideology, perhaps. And I wonder if maybe even that Sildihn. I don't want to absolve Sildihn because I'm sure that they did have some fault in the Sisters' War. But I wonder if their control of the water sources was just sort of a fact of their technological mastery, especially their hydraulic mastery.
I mean, they redirected all the water that was meant for Uldar to Sildihn. They're not blameless.
They're definitely not blameless, but you can see how it happened.
Yes.
You can see the routes that were taken while Uldar was busy focusing on sort of beefing itself up and getting the orders of thaumaturges and dark alchemy. Sildihn seems to have been focused on engineering some of this stuff, even if they did it selfishly.
I do think now's a good time to mention 2 things too. One important and one innocuous. One is that the musical theme, which I didn't think to mention, is actually a version of To the Sun, the Thanalan theme. And I love that that's the rendition. I love what they've done with the music. It's interesting because with Alo Alo, they didn't have necessarily something to tie it back to, and Rokon, they did have something more to tie back to. But I will never not love when they use a primary theme and then create a rendition of it.
I think it's like a piano cover of To the Sun, isn't it?
Basically. Now, the more innocuous point I was going to make is that, and I'm sure this exists elsewhere in the game, but I only noticed it when exploring the Sildihn Subterrain, but the fruits actually float in the water. There's actually some fruits that, like, float in the water, and the attention to detail there with that is actually quite lovely.
Yeah, they bob. I don't think I'm thinking about it, and I don't think I've ever seen that before. I know they're not massively HD or anything, but thinking about how far we come from the grapes.
The low poly grapes.
Yeah.
Speaking of grapes, do you find it interesting that we never see them, like, other than symbolically in the Subterrain? I feel like I would have been, like a giant patch of them might have made sense.
I think it's really interesting. I think the fact that we never see grapes in, like, actual grapes in Ul'dah, in Beledaya, in Sildih and even in Mark, is maybe a reference to an older culture. Maybe they grew in Yafame. Maybe they grew in the South Sea Isles. And it's sort of a held over sigil.
I do love the idea, and I realize this is not a fruit, but I do love the idea that it was the fruit of knowledge, and then it just shows a pumpkin, because there's the pumpkin patch in the Sultana's pumpkin patch.
Oh yeah, God, there's so much to discuss about the Sultana.
There's always so much to discuss about the Sultana and everything else. We got a Gubu down here, which, I mean, knowing how they spread around, I guess isn't the wildest thing, but it isn't, like, damn boy, do the Gubus show up just about everywhere. They are very Goob boys.
They will be absolutely anywhere that you can find them. We've even speculated that maybe in one of the promo images, the concept art images for Dawn Trail, there is perhaps sort of a New World variant of a Gubu. So they really do just get everywhere.
Oh, I totally forgot we even talked about that. We also have the Flairny. I'm totally forgetting if that's how you say their name, but which are the butterfly-looking things, and we will see more Vilekin around, especially in places like the sanitation sluices. But I don't wonder if they're not drawn specifically to these fruits, because we see them around them when you come into here.
I think that would make sense. Yeah, if they're attracted to the fruits, or even like this flowering stuff like Gubu's head, possibly.
We do know that the Gubus try to cultivate the flora on their head, so that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Moving on through, we get an Adamantoise and Leafkin. The Leafkin's funny to me because I don't think that, I'm sure that they exist maybe in like Labyrinthos or somewhere else where they were used before, but it is interesting that they're a Final Fantasy 11 reference.
Yeah, the Leafkin they're like the little mosslings, aren't they, basically?
Yeah, they're little shrubbery dudes. They're pretty cute. Funny enough, the reason I remember them more specifically now is not because I've played much of 11 yet, but actually because I've been playing the Final Fantasy trading card game, and there is a Leafkin card that I actually used in a deck. So now it's more firmly planted in my mind.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I like the way that it feels so vibrant and lived in here. It does feel like you're walking through an oasis, which I suppose you are, really. It's nice to see that although we will see certain areas which are still suffering from the legacy of the Trader's Spurn down here, it's nice to see that in certain other places there's almost more life. There's more preservation of life. There's more reclaiming of the area.
We also see, I think this is the first time we see off in the corner we see some of the puffballs that become important both to do with Silky, but also we see later on.
Yeah, the ones that you can choose to flatten or not flatten, basically.
Yeah, so speaking of that, let's head towards that and head into the Malachite Portico, which is an interesting little antechamber, effectively, I guess.
It's so Carnian.
Yes. And I feel like that's a repeating thing, is like, even with like the scales that we see later in Path 2, you see the lineage from earlier things to now. And I love that this game does that. Even in Alo Alo, you see some of the Nimian heritage, despite it being so disconnected in time. Or, it just, it's very good.
It almost feels directly like this chamber was built by someone trying to mimic the stuff in Karn, because you take something of value, in this case, not quite as representative as the stuff in Karn is with the different symbols, but still you have different bags of ore and stuff, and then you put it on a pedestal, on the pedestals, and it activates the magical element. which is impressive, by the way. They just have this big teleportation circle down here. That's pretty impressive.
It also only teleports you a couple feet away, and it's not even like in the middle path you have one that teleports you to a treasure chamber, and that I get. This kind of just teleports you to the other side. I'm not quite sure what the thought behind this mechanism was diegetically, let's just say. But yeah, also I guess worth pointing out that it is called the Malachite Portico. I guess, do you think that's in the idea that it's supposed to be like the greenery, especially in some of the rooms after? Or I mean, look, gemstones are important to Ul'dah, Sildih, Beldia, all those, and we're gonna have Nashasite later. So like the idea of green gems are important. But why do you think? Where do you think that name comes from?
Well, I do wonder if maybe it's the ore that we put on the pedestals. I wonder if we're putting malachite ore on the pedestals.
Yeah.
I mean, there's pretty much no malachite, no lore for what like malachite does in the game. You can mine it up, but it just says it's a green gemstone. I think greenery maybe it's usually in sort of desert cultures. Like I've been reading up a lot on North African native belief lately, and greenery is so interwoven with water gods and stuff like that. The sort of renewal of rain and of water and how that brings the green. So I wonder if there's something there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, also, so there's two things I want to hit on. One is the flower platter on the floor, but the other thing is I'm looking back and around right now. I'm in the dungeon staring at some of this, and one of the things I noticed that a lot of the pipes that are broken are full of sand, which is interesting. I also have to presume that some of these pipes must not be tied to Ul'dah's water supply, because if they're broken, I feel like they would have noticed the problem to their infrastructure. So I think that goes along with your idea that most of it's Sildihn in nature.
Yeah. I do wonder if maybe there was some element of tapping into it or taking inspiration from it. But I think in construction, it is, most likely Sildihn is my take. For the flower pattern, it's sort of continuing this idea that we had with the Malachite, right? Where greenery and plant life maybe are associated with water, which is associated with regality and of power.
Yeah, I mean it is specifically purple. We also have floral designs are being tied to this whole system with Nanamo's key and the door to enter it in the first place. So I wonder if that's. But it's interesting that to me, like, okay, it being a flower makes sense because it's a central point to stand on to teleport you. But you could have also imagined that it was, I don't know, a green flower instead to go with Malachite, or it could have been the grapes and you stand on the grapes to teleport you. So it is. A lot of times fan bases tend to find specific piece of information and then apply that to an entire culture as like the singular symbol or what have you, or something like Star Wars, right? The one character who's introduced was a bounty hunter, so every person from that planet is a bounty hunter, and that's all they do. Looking at you, Bosk. So there are multiple symbols. Just because like grapes or specific symbols have been tied to Sildih doesn't mean that, okay, everything does have to be that. But it's just interesting when it derivates, because there has to be specific intent with that, right? To come up with a separate symbol that's representative.
Yes. Right. So I've gone back and I've had a look at how the flags work, just because you spurred me on with the grapes. So in Belladaya, you had 4 symbols, 2 of which were on the flag. You had the flame of magic and the fruit of knowledge on the scales on the flag. You also had the helm of might and the gem of affluence. I think maybe it wasn't called helm of gem of affluence, but it was something like that. And then nowadays, obviously, Ul'dah has the flame of, might be the flame of might now, if we go by like Eorzean 1, or it might now be the flame of magic still.
I think it's flame of magic. I think that might be of an error in EE1.
I think it's possible, yeah. And then Sildih has the fruit of knowledge and the helm of might, which we've known that was a symbol. We've known that the helm of might was a symbol because it's in Khan. And we've assumed, we've discussed, if you go back to the Thanalan video, that the Helm of Might was probably associated with Sildih, just looking at the division. But it's interesting, and it's also interesting to see how, when we find the flag later on, the Helm of Might is torn off. It's just not on the flag.
Yep.
But then it's commented on in the note, so we know that it's there.
Oh, this is interesting. So like that, sorry, I do want to get back to that, but I am looking up some flags in game, and it seems like there is, note the sigil, the golden scales of order balance the jewel of prosperity with the flame of might. So it may have been that it was the flame of might in, I believe there's one use of flame of might, but it's by an unnamed NPC.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Maybe it's like because so clearly the Helm of Might exists.
Yeah.
I think maybe we assume that they got their wires a little crossed there. It doesn't happen often, but
Yeah, either they got the wires crossed or there's just convergence. So there is like the Helm of Might and the Flame of Might, or they weren't worrying about what Sildi's symbols were, and so they Ul'dah got the Flame of Might, got the Flame of Magic, renamed it Flame of Might because they were taking also Sil'dihn aspects, and so maybe originally Ul'dah. Yeah. Anyways,
yeah.
it's interesting, and I'm sure if one of you guys also has a clear clarification for the timeline of the symbol naming schema or where it may or may not conflict, feel free to comment down below. Let us move forward. So obviously, if you do the bags right, you get to teleport through the flower. But let's first walk through the door in front of us and just look at all the puffballs and leshy that exist in the other room. Have you ever played Yoshi's Island?
I have played Yoshi's Island.
Do you remember that one level where if you touch the dizzy puffballs, everything goes crazy?
Yes, yes, I do.
I feel like that was an inspiration for this room.
Yeah, I think that's possible. Yeah, actually, it does kind of have that sort of inspiration, doesn't it?
Yeah. And also, the Leshy are kind of interesting to me because the Leshy remind me of the enemies. You find some in Zadnor, but also the plant and tree people reference that are worshippers of Sephiroth. And obviously, I don't think that's what they're connecting to here, but I don't know of anywhere else in Eorzea that you really see plant people quite like them, at least natively. So it is interesting that they ended up here. It makes me wonder how they ended up here. Oh, and speaking of, there was an Adamantoise back earlier, which this may have nothing to do with it, but there is a leave quest where there's an Adamantoise that kind of escaped and is running around in Thanalan, and I can't help but wonder if that's in some way a reference to that.
It's an interesting take. I think that's possible. Leshies have definitely been, as far as we've seen them previously, an out of Eorzean thing. They've been in, other parts of the world. But I mean, I suppose there's no reason that there couldn't be small amounts of them. I've always taken obviously we don't know who the worshippers of Sephiroth were because we haven't been to Mericidia yet. But I always got the impression, or my theory was always that, insert pause here, please, editors, while I find what I'm looking for. The Bilokos were probably the inheritors of that sort of legacy because the Encyclopedia Eorzea 1 entry for them, their Seedkin, references that some scholars have tried, admittedly unsuccessfully, to draw comparisons between them and the Sephiroth worshippers. So although it's not confirmed, there is this sort of textual in-universe link between the two.
Yeah, it's hard to say, and things like Aloe Aloe and even Sildi Subterrain show that things can always change. While there's some establishment of the kind of peoples that are related, that would be related to Sephiroth, maybe they'll come up with a wholly new thing. But it's definitely worth meditating on whenever they choose to add a mob somewhere. I mean, as we've seen so far, pretty much all the mobs have been very intentional in their thinking, even when it's semi-asset reuse. So it's always worth meditating on.
Definitely. And there's also, while natural evolution isn't a major theme in the game and in its bestiary, the taxonomy is so loose and intentionally so. But there are there are arguments over whether this thing's a seedkin or elemental or a mammal, and it's not a mammal, a beastkin. And those are three extraordinarily different things. But okay, Mr. Taxonomist. But there is this association of almost degeneration. So you have sort of implications that maybe on top of the Ixali, there were maybe natural, more animalistic evolutions of the Ixalians and stuff like that, or of what they came from. So there is this trend of species evolving and devolving. So it's possible that there is almost, these sort of bipedal tree people with the Biloko and the Leshies, and there is in fact a subspecies of Leshy in the game that are like infected with fungus, Caloax or whatever they're called, and they've become a distinct species. So there's a possibility that all of these things interlink with each other.
Mm-hmm. Moving back through, we go onto the portal touchstone and we get teleported over into the other area off to the left, which again is just a very strange amount of space to be teleported to. Like not even forward, but just straight like to the left. And we see more floral patterns all on the ground, and as well as purple. But that's all. This is also the first time, I believe, assuming we go from left to right, that we see a Soulkin when we see some golems and snurbles.
And the golems they're sort of down pat for Thanalan, But we should recognize that although there is some implication that they can naturally form, the actual textual law that we have on them is that they are, created by people who can create Soulkin. And that's, that makes perfect sense. It's entirely possible that these were created by Sil'dihn, and they were the only defenders of the city that didn't die in the plague because they're immune to it.
Yeah, and we see if you start in Ul'dah, you see a bunch of these sorts of golems break out from the excavation site. And like we were saying at the top, the Maquis learned how to create Soulkin magic thanks to Amdapor to some extent. And we know that creation of Soulkin stayed hyper relevant in Beladia with Karn, and we know that we'll continue to see it both here. And then we also see that in some of the creations of Ul'dah, but also as well as kind of the further, it's not quite the same, but innovations around Forgekin and Soulkin with Mammoths.
Absolutely. There's, like we've discussed before, there's this evolution of the craft and how it differentiates into societies, and I just find it really fascinating. It's one of the things that most sort of scratches that part of my brain about the sort of lineage from Mark into Sil'dihn, into Beladia, into Sil'dihn and all that. I find it really fascinating.
In this area, we also get a custodian's closet, which is it like just was it just a random janitor's closet? I'm so confused, like what exactly it was supposed to. But importantly, we do find a giant ewer in there, which one, every time I see a ewer, I just think of Thaliak. But two, it's a really great little story about a ewer that held an entire oasis with it. I also can't not look at that ewer and realize it's a reused asset of the, I think Mateus?
Yes, it is. It is.
Which, like, I mean, fair enough, but also maybe at least retexture it.
I'm not sure if it's Mateus. I think it's the other water one, maybe. Because I think it's not only like in the mechanic of his fight. I think even in 11, like he just holds it to him. Like I think it's he always has it. So it's a bit like the first time I saw it, I was like, oh well, that's that. But it's also interesting that the janitor's closet has what is
Famfrit. Sorry, not Mateus. Famfrit.
Famfrit, right? It's interesting that a janitor had what is, especially in the desert civilization, an extraordinary relic. But this is it's implied to be Ul'dah, right? Or at least Sil'dihn then Ul'dah. Yeah, so I think that's interesting. I think that it almost
or at least the tail is.
Yes, yeah, because at least it was possessed at some point by Ul'dah. So that's interesting to me. I wonder why it was hidden down here, presumably by the Sultan.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I would have sworn that that's probably a tale that already existed somewhere I guess diegetically in game. I would love if there was like some U tribe member or something who mentioned like a story about that elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, I find it to be interesting. I do wonder if, we know that functionally all of the citizens of Sildihn, the city, died. And Sildihn, like Ul'dah, is a city-state, so most of its population is centered in and around its capital. So presumably the vast majority of their citizenry died. But I do wonder if, probably parts of Thanalan were inhabited by smaller villages of Sildihn's, like, culture, and I'm assuming that these were absorbed into Ul'dah. So it's possible that it's passed down through that, or through contact with the U-Tribe, like you said, maybe it's a Maquis relic.
I mean, that's the thing, right? Especially with flooding tales. But look, if the Maquis can survive, and then the Beladians, and then the Sildihns, and then the Ul'dah, like, I don't think it's the wildest thing. I think it also would go along with the way in which, if you look especially at the lore as it's built in EE1, and in, I think, like, the earlier part of the game, there was a lot of, like, mass migration and people getting subsumed into other people. A real emphasis on trying to make, I don't want to just say realism, but tying in kind of how the real world tends to work with. It's not... a lot of times everything blurs into each other. It's not these like harsh, stark lines that we like to think of.
Absolutely. And speaking of Mac, we see that with Mac, for example, like the Beladia and its successors are not the only successors of Mark. The Garabanian tribes also are successors of Mac to a certain degree. And then we even get the implication that some Mac elements migrated into Ilsabad. So there's this wide spectrum, and like you said, it does. Well, it's not copying real life. It does, and it's not necessarily. I mean, I think it is realistic. I don't think it's attempting to be fully realistic, but I think it succeeds in being at least somewhat realistic.
Yeah, a groundedness and a form of realism to it for sure. It's interesting because sometimes I feel like that's been, I don't want to say lost a little, but because the narrative is so focused on such a briefer period of time with us playing it, that kind of sense of natural movements of peoples over time can't be really shown in the game as we play it now. Since effectively, thanks to Time Bubble, at most it's been, what, 4 years? And quite possibly only 1.
Yeah, the time situation is. I do somewhat wish that was addressed, but we'll get there someday, I'm sure.
One
And
day.
it doesn't impair my enjoyment of the game.
So we get the feather dusters that were probably Nanamo's mother, based on the fact that her love of cleaning is noted in one of the notes.
Yeah, which I guess is supposed to be sort of like an attempt to appeal to her. We know that she was ostensibly upper middle class, so I guess it's an attempt to sort of humanize her and make sort of play into that.
I just think of it as anxiety cleaning, but that works too.
Well, obviously, cleaning is an important part of her and her eventual magic as well.
Yeah, well, and I guess I think about it another way is that if you think about the 2 different ways you get to Silky, one way establishes the palms, the giant puffballs, and the other way is establishing the cleaning supplies as kind of that idea of cleaning. So whichever you get, you kind of have some setup for the boss right before you go in.
Yeah. It's they do this is something the game often does very well, is that they'll teach you the mechanic and then they'll escalate it. But they also do it with some of the, I'm not even going to say lore because I don't feel like it's necessarily lore, but some of the design elements maybe.
Environmental details.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely think the game has gotten better about it in recent years, and especially the past 2 expansions of show A, show B, show AB, show A, show C, show AC, then show BC. And then show thing that you didn't prep, but you understand the fundamentals of, stuff like that. I love it. Okay, shall we move on from the Shaded Solace into the Forgotten Forecourt?
We absolutely should. And there are extremely adorable final boss, not counting a certain night.
I will say, if you've done Criterion Savage, that mouse.
Yeah. So I had only ever done the dungeon in groups until I came to do some research for this, and it's not that she's tough in normal mode on solo, because she's not necessarily, but she can really catch you out sometimes, especially if you don't know your rights and lefts quite as well.
Absolutely. I know, and she has great mechanics too. And I don't think I've given enough credit to this. Between Garen and her, and the other bosses as well, I do feel like the variant dungeons have been some of like the really ingenuitive mechanics. Like, it feels like they're trying to come up with some new stuff, and try out different ideas and different things that we've never either haven't seen before, or are like a pretty stretched variant of the sort of things that we've seen in the past. And I also really like that for variants, because what it allows variants is look, variant dungeons are not hard by any stroke, but it does feel like it's a lot of times harder than maybe some normal bosses, or like a normal dungeon, or at least it's just like more. There's more a different kind of cleverness, a clever sensibility to it.
I mean, I should know. I did it the masochistic route, and I did it solo on healer.
Lordy.
On mage, so my I was basically just waiting for Blood Lily to come up, and then I could hit them with that, and that would like take a big chunk out of them. But the rest of it, I was just spamming glare. But yeah, I think they're engaging gameplay wise. I thought originally they were going to be. I don't want to be harsh on like Palace of the Dead, because I think there's a lot of entertaining stuff in Palace of the Dead, but and other dungeons like that, or
The deep dungeons.
Yeah, but it does feel much more mechanically engaging, which makes sense because they developed a Savage for it, but it does feel like much more engaging than that. And some of the fights as well do feel at least better than like a mid boss in a dungeon. Maybe like the end boss in a dungeon would have a little bit more sophistication, but most of the bosses in dungeon, it seems like that they feel like they're a little bit more inspired than, like they had a little bit more creative energy put into them, like getting their mechanics.
Yeah, and that's continued to go on. I think Rokon, I think mechanically I would say Rokon is better than Sildihn Subterrain, even if there's stuff I like about Sildihn a little bit more. Aloe is really, has some stuff going on, and the Criterions are a lot of fun too. Some of them, like Sildihn Criterion, it can be a little bit bullshit just because having to control the orientation of those puffballs is a nightmare. But okay, that's a whole other conversation. Let's talk about Silky. Let's talk about the zombie mouse squirrel that is not actually an entity, but a summoned elemental familiar, and also how it's I'm not saying it's a cordyceps, but I am saying that the fluff is the actual familiar. It's not the mouse. The mouse is just a ethereal puppet dancing to the tune and the strings of the puffball that is the tail.
I mean, if they couldn't have made it any more obvious, the puffball literally mops the floor with Silky with the chinchilla. I always thought it was a chinchilla.
Oh my god, it does look like a chinchilla, and I also never thought about that. Yeah, when it does the squeaky clean left to right thing, it's sweeping out. It's using the mouse as the... Oh, that's funny. That's really funny.
And then there's obviously in Japan, and I think just naturally, there's an association of chinchillas with cleaning. Like if you think of like Sinochino, the Pokemon.
They're very fastidious.
Yeah, it like brushes with his hair clean. So I wonder if maybe it's supposed to be a chinchilla. Where are chinchillas from? Hold on, let me have a. I wonder if they're from a desert lake area.
That would make sense with their dust baths.
Oh, they're from they're from the Andes in South America.
Okay, I was about to say I knew South America. I didn't know where in South America. It was all set up for Dawn Trail.
Right? I mean,
the Leafkin were actually just hints echoes of Vanadil. Definitely that was definitely what the Leafkin were for. But by the way, if anyone's wondering where we got that information on the tail being the actual creature, it's the mount description.
Yes, it's fascinating as well. I'm not going to say that Nanasha was a powerful mage, but she was obviously very talented with ethereal sort of manipulation in some manner. I mean, we know that she had personal training from Sharlayan mages, so there's something there. But
even then,
yeah, she had some ability.
Yeah, it is also interesting that familiars continuing to exist after the masters are long dead is a theme that actually basically pops up in all 3 of the variant dungeons. I don't know if that's intentional but it is interesting that exists both with Silky, with a certain fairy girl, I'll say.
Yeah.
A certain fairy with a gun.
Yeah, with a gun.
Yeah, I do want to just go back and talk about the arena for a second too, because one, we've got the same floral design that we see around and purples as which I guess that floral design becomes important later on too when we have, well, I guess I say later on, but literally in 1 second as we go into the flower garden. But I do love that you can see, I mean, not only the beautiful sky, but you can also see more of the fluff balls around. So you have to assume that that's part of what the inspiration for Silky, for Nanamo's mother, was, because that puffball is really similar to the tail, let's say.
Yeah, definitely. Especially with the law that is actually what Silky is. I think you have to assume there's some connection, either inspiration or like she actually studied them to discover how to create these sort of properties. It's hard to say.
Actually used one as a foci.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
I do love that the fight changes based on some of the different things you do, like for instance the Ewer attack, if you happen to find the Ewer in the Custodian's Closet. But because we could talk probably infinitely about all those different variants, let us instead kill the mouse and continue on into the beautiful, beautiful sunlit garden.
And I think, me, I like my historical parallels. It's interesting that the Beledians had a culture of royal flower gardens as well, because in Khan we find rosariums of sultans of Beledia. Obviously there aren't roses in here, but there's clearly almost like this royal association with flowers and with flowering plants and trees and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that also, there's 2 things. One, this whole area is a groundwater intake, so it's interesting that I assume that part of it, the reason it became as vibrant as it did, is because of that. But we do see 2 things that are interesting to me here. One is that we see these flowers that are pink rather than necessarily purple, or at least to my eye, anyways. But we also see some like pretty stark red leaves as we come in. It's interesting to me that there's not like an established, like, this is the flower this is supposed to be right off the bat, right? It's not like they go to great lengths to say like, this specific flower was associated with Sil'dihn. I wonder if it will become relevant. And then you get to the sunlit garden, right? Instead, it's just this beautiful patchwork of color.
Yeah, I wonder if maybe they didn't think that necessarily that hard about it. I think something that is worth noting is that in the Silky Boss room, we have the pink flowers on the outside, and then we have the yellow and orange flower in the middle. So those colors are represented still in that area. But I don't know if that's just sort of an aesthetic choice by the developers or if it means anything. I wonder if this I wonder if this was a Sildihn Royal garden. We know that obviously it was important to Nanamo's parents specifically, that they came here and sort of made this place their own. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if this was, like how Beledia had rosariums for the sultans. I wonder if this was the Sildihn's sort of sultans version of that, and then it was adopted, of course, by Nanamo's parents.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, look, we have the whole like little courtyard area where you fight Silky. Because it's the groundwater intake, there's two possibilities, right? This was also a Sildihn garden, or this was basically where her parents set up the area where her parents had their little table and all that was actually a place where this was like a station where you could look out and see the groundwater intake and the water coming through or being built up, and that it only became a place of more foliage as time moved on and just this naturally arose. Part of what makes me wonder that is that all the plants in here are kind of haphazard. There's not like any sort of sense of cultivation necessarily. It's more that it just seems that they just happened to grow.
I see that, but I do also wonder the fact that there's the portcullis, not the portcullis, sorry, the
Roofless gazebo.
yeah, this sort of roofless gazebo area. The fact that it has sort of trees lining up it is interesting to me. I could really imagine it a more cultivated version of this that has gone wild over the ages.
Mm-hmm.
But it could really go either way. But the fact that there is this, it's not just a normal viewing platform, and the fact that the area before it is so obviously ornate with all the floor tiles and stuff like that, it does feel like, it feels like there was some significance here. The Rosarium sort of heritage is my own thing, but I think even if it wasn't a Sildihn thing, I think it's interesting that it crops back up as a royal garden with, even if an informal one, with our latest generation.
Yeah.
Also, there's a bag in there. Do you think there's just like moldy croissants or something in there? Like,
I'm gonna go with that's tea. I think that's a bag full of tea.
that's possible, yeah.
Based on all the grinder and the cups and the mug and the funnel. It's either tea or coffee, honestly, looking at all that.
I suppose thinking about the fact that it's sort of all that's like vaguely Arabic-y inspired, it could be coffee. That could be definitely the case.
Mm-hmm. I also guess want to take that time to point out and appreciate the fact that we do get so much more about Nanamo's parents, because we didn't really talk about this at the top, but I love the function of having a guide through each of the variant dungeons. And I think that while I know a lot of people really enjoyed Hancock and thought he was hilarious and Rokon, and I love Matsuya, don't get me wrong, I do think to some extent Nanamo's is the most successful for me for tying the character to it, in that we've known about her parents' death. We've known about all the lore information about that for, since at least 2.0, and then especially, I know for sure by 3.0. But we never really got a lot of her thoughts or feelings about it. We never really got any, and we don't get a lot about her parents. Like being able to actually see their characters models and get a bit of catharsis around their passing with Nanamo, and I think is really great. And I think the fact that the path that you would probably do first, at least I feel like most people I know did this path first, it would be this sort of beautiful little end with that. I think a really, really lovely touch.
Yes, I think something that maybe we can put down to, more of a rumor than a truth is the fact is, the Miss Beard slept with Nanamo's mother thing. I think that's probably more of like a pirate's rumor. I don't think it happened. We have more context on the relationship now.
He doesn't seem like the type. I totally forgot
No.
about that. Would you like to explain that for anyone who's not in the know?
So if you've ever run Sestashio before, you'll know that the last area is called the Sultana's Lap. And in fact, there is an in-universe rumor that Mistbeard, upon stealing like parts of the Ul'dah treasury, had sex with Nanamo's mother. But I don't think it probably happened. I think we could probably consign that to this is a rumor, not the truth.
Early, which would be very Eorzean and very Limson. I will have to say, early Final Fantasy XIV lore is a lot more, I don't know what the right term, I don't want to say dark, I don't want to say gritty, but like, there were people on the team getting away with a lot more. Let's just say sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess that draws our first route to a close. And it only took us about 2 hours.
I think we've got a lot of the context out now, and we can sort of refine it down a bit.
I'm sure. And I'm sure in the editing, this will be cut down quite a bit. But for those of you at home, we've been going for about 2 hours at this point.
There's a good half hour of me saying left to take out, so.
Oh, have I ever shown you that supercut of all the ums?
I love the uncut.
It's so good. I should release one of those one of these days. Okay, setting aside that, shall we move on to the middle path then?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so we head down the middle path and we get into the further, well, I guess the cistern system, basically, which, further water control. And this goes along with some of that earlier comments I was making about reminding me of Nim. I mean, obviously, I guess Nim's whole mechanisms were more advanced, but definitely still the same ballpark.
I mean, you see water wheels, you see giant pipes, you see sort of a lineage to the Fifth Astral Era, and it's just natural to think of Nim.
Yeah. Can't say Lalafell aren't industrious.
Well, exactly. I'm sure that I haven't played Aloe yet, but I don't know if perhaps there's, maybe elements of that you see there. Is there?
There is, interestingly enough, not up until a certain point, and there are certain points that, let's just say, yes, there is more infrastructure than you would expect in certain areas. Also, importantly, though, Aloe is interesting, which we'll talk about that when we do our lore talk on it, but Aloe is interesting in that many peoples have resided there, and we don't know all the different kinds and different ones at different points. But you see some of where the Nimians returned and definitely took some of their tech, even if they were limited in resources. Imagine Nim level infrastructure, if not mechanical complexity, but Nim level infrastructure to an extent. But the only material you had was like bamboo, or
right,
specific types of wood.
Yeah, so it's almost like there is a hydraulic legacy. I know I keep saying that word, but it seems like in Lalafellan societies, it's a major thing.
Well, when have they not been associated with water? Like, think about it. Aloe, Nim, Mach is, surrounded by water. It's now the Weeping City, but you were also near to the coast.
Yeah, and it was founded on rivers.
Yeah. As we've said earlier, Beladia, Ul'dah, and Sil'dihn are all deeply tied to water, despite being in a desert. So I don't know that there's any history of the Lalafell on the source not being deeply associated with water to some extent. I guess you could argue on the first with the dwarves, but I mean, different people.
Yeah, such a different context there. Yeah, and I mean, hell, a lot of the dwarves' technology is steam-based.
Oh, yeah, that's a fair point. So the first enemies we get are some basically wave cannon water elementals, which makes sense. We see a lot of enemies, if they aren't, I guess I shouldn't say natural world because they're still natural, but we see a lot of enemies that are kind of tied to weird ethereal, I don't want to say issues, but confluences, and water spirits I think are a good indication of that. They're elementals that are basically made from, I don't want to say abundance of water ether, but basically that.
Like at least a concentration.
Yes. But moving on, we get into a wider room, still more water and mechanisms, and it's interesting the way in which they've tried to tie the idea that water is kind of always important along all three routes, at least in the first half. But the way that they've also tried to deviate, or not deviate, but try to make them seem different. So, for instance, you have the large pipe work in the irrigation ducts, which, I mean, makes sense. It carries the water, but you then in the cistern have much more of the wheels to give a different vibe.
Right. And it's almost, this area feels almost to me more like heavy and, I don't want to say oppressive because that's not quite what I'm sort of getting at, but almost more solid than the other area. Maybe that's just because it's in slightly better shape.
But also notice that it's not as vaulted. Like, while there are chambers in here that have high roofs from your standpoint, if you compare all the chambers in the cistern system compared to the irrigation ducts, you don't really get as large of spaces. Like, the first point at which you get a space that is of similar scale and scope is when you get to the sifting site and matched with the silt pump. But that's kind of a necessity because of the boss arena needing to be the same size. And even then, it still doesn't quite feel as open.
I think, yeah, it feels almost more crowded in there. I think the stuff just sort of closes it in a little bit more.
Well, and that continues to be true, right? You get out into the Springs Passage and everything feels open, whereas you walk into the Corridor of Rule and things are still pretty... You feel, not claustrophobic, but you're in an indoor space,
Yeah, you feel more definitively underground, I suppose, as opposed to just in like a ditch, which is maybe not the right term, but you know what I mean with that.
Yeah.
So why do you think this section connects to the royal chambers?
Interesting question.
Is it, again, the association with royalty? Was royalty seen as maybe a part of their royal responsibility was keeping control of the water? Maybe that's why?
Maybe. I mean, it is interesting that the cistern system leads directly into the like food chamber, right? It leads into the Sultana's table and the royal bed chamber. I guess it is kind of weird that it could lead into the royal bed chamber. But then again, I guess that kind of makes sense because if you think about it from the standpoint of Nanamo's bedroom seems to have an escape route
That's a good point.
based off what happens in the royal banquet. And I feel like there's a lot of interesting parallels between the Quarter of Rule that we see and the bits that we do see of places like Nanamo's bedchamber. Like, I wouldn't even be surprised if the royal bedchamber wasn't actually just a reused asset version of Nanamo's bedchamber to a degree.
I think that's possible, and I do like the idea of it being. It doesn't necessarily look. Actually, can we take a look at the entrance out? It looks almost like it could have been like a disguised fireplace.
Oh yeah, the entrance into the royal bedchamber from the split off. Yeah, it does look like it absolutely 100% looks like a disguised fireplace. You see, there's even logs of wood.
Right. So this is definitely like a hidden escape tunnel. So okay, that makes sense then.
Yeah. So I think that's what I wonder if in fact, I bet you, looking at the passage from the food chamber into the cistern itself, I bet you this was always meant to be a double escape passage, and that usually the door into the cistern wasn't even open itself.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Because it looks like just a flat wall.
The fact that it's open when we get to it is interesting. Does that imply an attempt to escape by the Sildihn royalty?
I mean, well, we might be reaching, but I feel like it's definitely something you could imply. And it would also be reasonable. I mean, think about it. If the fall of Sildih's happening and they need to get away from the undead, escaping through those passages makes a lot of sense.
Right, definitely. And then maybe discovering that it's not so viable, but or maybe escaping or being caught, who knows? But I think that's the fact that it's so clearly a fireplace in the bedroom is an interesting perspective. That definitely almost confirms the theory that it's an escape passage.
But let's go back one quick second just to cover the bits before that. We've got the Sarcosuchus. I don't know how to pronounce that, but basically just crocodilians living in the. Someone flushed them down the toilets in Ul'dah. Actually, I say that as a joke, but maybe that actually is what happened knowing Ul'dah. Like some rich merchant just flushed some croc eggs down the toilet.
Well, the Velodyna is in. Does the Velodyna flow down into Thanalan? I don't think it does, right? Because that's where we find most of those crocodiles. So
I don't think so. I think it flows out into. I'm forgetting the name of the sea, but there's the sea that's out the like bay area outside of the Black Shroud is I think where it flows into.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. So yeah, because it flows past the Black Shroud, doesn't it? So yeah, it wouldn't be that. Okay. Because that's where we see most of them. So I was like, maybe they came in through the river or through some sort of connection. But no, I like the idea that they were flushed down the toilet by some stupid tourists.
Moving on forward, we get to the our arena, the sifting site, which honestly, I wonder what was being sifted through. I mean, just detritus or
yeah, I would assume just sediment and stuff like that.
I guess I just don't know the difference between a silt pump and a sifting site. Then I guess
the silt pump pumped it in and then it was sifted at. Oh well, the water and the silt come out in different pipes.
Okay.
Maybe it's silted. It's sort of sifted out and then it's pushed over.
Yeah, the water's being pumped in through the silt pump and the sifting site, and then the settling basin, it lets it all settle so the clean water can flow through and the silt and sediment can settle to the bottom. Okay, yep, that makes sense.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that settling basins are most commonly used nowadays to collect poop out of wastewater.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, that's the most dangerous thing. Gotta worry about the antibiotic-resistant poop. That's our biggest danger. You laugh, but it's true.
True.
We get a variant of Gray in here. I mean, we talked about him, not really anything new to say.
Yeah, not particularly.
I'm going to say his name every different way I possibly can. Garyon, Grayon, Girion. Some names just don't stick in my head. It does not help that there are names in this game that, well, actually, I do like this about the game. There are names in this game that are pronounced just multiple ways. Like, I think Bosnia is pronounced 3 different ways. I think it's Bosnia, Bozia, and Bosja.
Yep.
Love that shit. But we get into the Sultan's table, so the meal room, and it almost feels like it was left, I don't want to say left in a hurry, but it was like semi-set. So yeah, I feel like that would explain if the cistern passage was open, if people fled from here to there.
Yeah, absolutely. The tablecloth skewed, the chairs are knocked over. There was definitely something happening in here, and then people turned and fled into the escape tunnel. And it also continues our theme of purple and royalty being intertwined, which I don't think survived into Uldar. That doesn't seem to be necessarily a factor in Uldar's, at least not as overt one.
I think it's just a different of associated color. I mean, because gold, I mean, you have like black for the flames. You have gold that's used as a metal much more staunchly and specifically for Ul'dah, where it's like silver is commonly associated with Sil'dih based on some of the notes. I don't know, what color would you associate with Ul'dah other than gold? Because I mean, like, I think blues, reds, black.
Yeah, I definitely think of the warmer colors than purple. Like I think of like oranges and reds and blacks and golds are like the definitive Ul'dah colors. And then for Sil'dih, it seems like it's mostly purple from what we've seen. And then blacks as well.
Oh, see, I definitely see white and like the alabaster, like stone you see everywhere.
I feel like some of Ul'dah's royal sector is a little bit whiter as well.
The royal quarter is still like a very yellow, not even sandstone, but
paladins are white though.
Yeah, I guess paladins are silver, but I mean, like by the same token, it's not like there aren't gold accents here in these rooms. I think there's just like the primary associative color. I think of white and purple when I think, like, even if you think about this throne of Sil'dih, right? Those are its colors for the most part.
Right, and the Ul'dah flag has a golden scale, and the Sildihn one has a white or silver one.
Yeah, silver. They specifically call out that it's a silver scale, in one of the notes.
So there's definitely sort of an opposing color scheme, at least associated with certain aspects of the cultures.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel when you first arrived in here? I guess we probably should have asked each other that earlier, but just the first time I arrived in here, the feeling of being able to see more about Sil'dih and like Sil'dih as it was just a lovely little. It was very exciting for me.
Well, I think that I had like a different reaction to each one. So the first time I went to the left path, which is what I did first, I was like, whoa, they were so technologically advanced. And then when I came in here, I was like, we are getting to see the intact royal palace of Sil'dih. This is something that I never dreamed we would get to see. So I was so overjoyed by that. Yeah,
it mirrors my emotions exactly. Moving on into the main chamber itself of the Quarter of Rule, it's very interesting to me that they had a lot of, I mean, they're dead now, but these trees, like they had foliage and you know, they had greenery that would have resided in here even semi-underground. Because if you look above, and there's no gateway or openness to the sun, which I guess depends on whether or not, like, there are no windows. So to some extent, this was never planned to be majorly above ground. And all the lights are almost like this subterranean blue glow. Despite that, we not only see this foliage here, but we also see probably some of the starkest grape imagery in some of the entire dungeon in the Dead in the Center.
Right, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Gold Court in Ul'dah, doesn't that also have a fountain?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think it also has like this greenery around it as well. So that's another interesting thing to look at. But this is almost more. It's smaller and more personal, but it's almost more sort of classically regal in how it's laid out.
Yes, agreed.
But there are definitely through lines here. They've both got this sort of circular, multi-leveled area. They've got this central fountain. You know, aspects of greenery are in there.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, kind of like how ARR is supposed to be compressed space. I also wonder how much of this is supposed to be conceptually compressed space, because it has to be a dungeon. You know, it has to work on that level.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting, nevertheless, to see how it almost holds, a resemblance to each other. We've talked about this so many times already in this video, but I think it bears repeating sort of ad infinitum, that you can really trace the lineage from Khan into these two cities.
Mm-hmm. Really starkly, and we'll see that even with the boss at the end of this. Also, I love that we're at the point in making these videos together that we not only like give pretext, or not pretext, but like we like say we know we've said it already, but it bears repeating, that it's getting to the point that I'm almost wanting to say I know we've said it already before, that we've said it already before, but it bears
I think yeah, you would probably be right.
Like of the preemptive, like scholarly desire to want to convey context and not defensively, but like preemptively explain our rationale for But moving on into the bedchamber, yeah, very continuing on with all that color schema. And it is interesting that there's a lot more gold accents here than anywhere else. We didn't see a lot, particularly in the first, and we don't really see that much in the left or the right path. But it is interesting that even though silver is commonly associated with Sil'dih, at least with their scales, gold still remains a very strong accent color.
Yeah, and I suppose, the people who are modeling this and designing it are still artists, and purple and gold are such a classic combo that maybe it just appeals to them in some way. Even if I do think that this shade of purple actually doesn't go with the gold very well.
I see. I kind of like it, but maybe I'm just wrong. I think part of it's too the fact that one, gold is royal, and it communicates that idea very quickly and clearly to people who may not know. But also that since white is the other color that you're seeing around with the stone, it makes me wonder if they wanted gold for a stronger contrast, because silver would have blended in pretty thoroughly.
Absolutely, I think that's absolutely the case. I also think it's interesting thinking about it now, the fact that they have the gem of affluence in the Thorne flag, and they have the gold, and then they have the helm of might. And although it's noted as a silver scale, it almost makes my mind go to like iron, and these more mundane, more sort of functional, almost more mechanical metals.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I also am staring right now at the seats, and I just realized that the pattern on the seats is supposed to be an abstracted grape.
Is it really? Is that what it's supposed to be?
I think it's supposed to be an abstracted a bunch of grapes.
See, to me, it looks like a uterus.
What are uteruses if not a bunch of grapes? Giving no other context to that, and moving along, one of the things that I like going from the royal chamber around is that the sort of curvature and like passages on the side are really reminiscent of the way that the chamber of rule is up in Ul'dah proper compared to the quarter of rule, like that sort of curving around a central space.
Yeah, it's very, very similar. There is definitely some of the statues up here are interesting as well.
Oh, definitely.
With the fact that they seem to sort of, they're using claymores and stuff like that, which isn't something that we've necessarily seen before in Thanalanian culture.
Yeah, these statues are really interesting to me. I mean, I'm pretty sure they're asset reuse. I swear to God, I've seen them somewhere else, maybe Ishgard or something. But they are really interesting, and they are coupled with a lot of other architectural details, be it the grapes or other little bits and bobs that are interesting. What's also interesting to me is that I don't know if their swords have been changed, even if they are, but their swords are Beladine swords, I believe. Beladine or Sildihn swords. You see that same type of model of their sword in
Khan.
Oh, Great Gooble? No. Great Gooble actually has one of their weapons.
Oh.
You can actually see a Beladine sword. And so I think it's interesting that they actually went to those lengths to actually make at least that match.
The Beladine Analyst. Oh, yeah. It's not a one-to-one, but there are definitely design similarities, actually. I see that. Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah. Google is really great, actually. Google is really fantastic for this kind of stuff.
Yeah, Google has all sorts of crazy stuff and different weapon glams that are from historical periods. There are a couple other ones that are... Oh, I don't remember what they are, but there's a couple other ones that are like the only indication of certain cultures that we get.
Yes.
In this room, though, I forget which ones we fight. I know you fight in the other room, but we fight Dullahans, and I want to talk about that just because it's, further talking about Soulkin, their forged suit of armors. And we've gotten golems, and now we've gotten suits of armors, and then we're going to have an even more advanced piece. Advanced, I guess might be a weird word, but advanced piece of magical Soulkin frickery in a little bit here coming up at the end. But I think just that repetition tying back to Karn, like you were saying, of Soulkin, and interestingly enough, and we didn't talk about this earlier, but there is a extreme dearth of undead in the Sildihn Subterrain, which makes sense, seeing as they were all meant to be wiped out and slayed. But it's funny because if you had asked me before we went into had Sildihn Subterrain as a variant dungeon, I would have thought the one thing it would have been replete with would have been undead. Yeah,
at least some residual undead. Or I mean, this royal palace area is in remarkably good condition. I guess maybe there weren't any undead in here to cleanse. Maybe the Thorne forces didn't fight in here, but who knows?
Yeah, it's very interesting.
We do, of course, see some spears in here. It makes sense that although they're an Ishgardian thing in sort of modern day, that every culture would have had spears. And then there are these strange... They look like they were fountains. They almost a Greek Orthodox cross on them or something at the top.
Yeah, I was looking at, that's exactly what I was thinking of. What's interesting is that actually those, if you look at those, they kind of look like an inverted, in some ways, part version of these spears that you see around. I definitely think you're right that they were fountains, and part of the reason I think that is, one, because they could definitely looks like they could be spewing water out of the two ends of them, the upside down U. But if you look at the bed of those structures, and then you look at the bed of the central structure, it's the same texture.
Right.
which looks like a dried out bedrock that's a distinct different texture to everything else, which definitely to me implies that was definitely supposed to be a fountain.
Yeah, yeah. There's some details in here that really drive me crazy, like those fountains and some of the design going into them. Oh, and some of the statues have spears as well.
It is wild to me. Like, I don't want to just say the attention to detail. That's just such an extra piece of set dressing that you didn't have to make sense of it.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate it.
There's more flower motifs on them as well.
Yeah, you beat me to it as well. I was about to say.
It does feel like there's almost this association with plant life and legitimacy or prestige in the Sildihn royal family, which, if they control water, like we said before, makes a lot of sense.
So in this room, we have one version of the banner. We have one version of the banner here, which has the Fruit of Knowledge. The other banner in the main hall has the Helm of Might, which are two pieces of the information that this is like another example of what I was talking about way earlier on about knowing lore ahead of time. And where if you had done Karn and you knew about Sildihn, you could know all this information without having to do these puzzles. And I love when the game lets you preemptively learn things or be prepped and learn about the lore of a thing in a way that is somewhat helpful. And I think Variant Dungeons get to play that off in spades.
Yeah, I think this one does it really well. I mean, pretty much every element that they deliver on could be fed into from previous lore, so it's really, really successful in that sort of attempt.
Okay, I'm just quick side thought. This door and the fact that this is modeled back here, I think there might have been meant to be
another route,
another route of some kind.
I think that's possible. Also, the door that we were just at, not this one, the other one in the room with the banner. It looks like an old man's face.
Yes, I was thinking. I thought I was thinking a baboon. I was thinking of a baboon.
I see the baboon.
Moving on into the audience chamber, we've got much of the same sort of stuff we were talking about earlier, but also we specifically have the throne. And I love all the grape motifs. I also love the fact that there's the two plates on it. Probably maybe grapes were held there.
Yeah, like a grape and a helm or something, maybe.
It is so interesting to me that the scales are so specifically said to be the silver scales, whereas like this chair is white, purple, and gold is like the aesthetic.
Yeah, it's the sunburst almost symbols in the middle of the chair almost look like a Japanese chrysanthemum sort of symbol to me in a certain way.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
I mean, there are just grapes all over this room.
Yeah, it's like the closer you get to their seat of power, the more grapes there are, which, I mean, hey, makes sense. That is like an incredibly strong and specific symbol. Oh, wow. I mean, there's even more than I could. Literally, almost every motif is either some version of the floral symbol or some version of the grape symbol.
It's so interesting how much more overtly they rely on the grapes than they do on the helm.
Well, the helm's interesting because if you look at all the statues, the helm's depicted there, right? And I think so the idea is that the helm is the martial might, and so that's what the statues are meant to staunchly represent.
Definitely, but it does feel almost underrepresented comparative to the grapes, which are just everywhere.
Yeah, but once you do that, we get to go into the secret room behind the throne and get to do a little puzzle, which if you've been paying attention or have done Karn or know your lore, you'd be able to solve what the different bounds should be. So the Fruit of Knowledge and Helm of Might for the Sildihn. Although I wish that if you put like the flame and the gem on it, it would like do something bad to you. Or maybe it does. I don't think I've ever actually done it.
Yeah, this is just overtly Belladine.
Yes. I mean, it literally is almost the same model, everything.
Yeah, pretty much. And then there's the aether crystals behind it.
What I do love about the aetherite in here is that, one, I love that it looks like an hourglass, but two, it actually kind of just looks like two aethernets put together.
I almost think maybe it is. maybe it's like a modified aethernet that was just reused and like changed a bit.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that Charlian wasn't sharing as much of its knowledge at this time, right, for aetherites?
Well, Charlian began the construction of the aetherite network and then stopped it because of the War of the Sisters.
Right. So that makes sense why they would have access to that technology. Okay, yep.
Specifically, it was the Uldans or the Sildihns used Charlian built aetherites to like space an enemy army into the aether. They used, as they tried to teleport, they disrupted it and it just like discorporated them into the live stream.
Well, because they were using them to control their troop movements, and then one of them destroyed an aetherite while it was in use, and an entire like section of an army was just lost.
Yeah, which is pretty dark, but that's a really interesting thing actually that hadn't occurred to me. The fact that this is sort of a vestige of that very, very early aetherite network that was beginning to form and then stopped.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it makes sense then that it's larger because it's effectively more of a prototype compared to the Ethernet system we have now.
Right, exactly.
Okay, but if you solve it correctly, you get to move into the secret treasure chamber, which is, well, I mean, honestly, it's interesting in its own right. Not surprising that the Sildihn have a treasure chamber, but what it is kind of interesting to me is Nald Thal statues. Is that their veneration of Nald Thal was just as strong as Uldah's, apparently.
I mean, these are fancier than Altar statues that Uldar has in the modern day.
Yeah.
And there's the fact that, I mean, their base skeletons are pretty similar, actually. They've just got, the glowy stuff and a bit more ornamentation. But it does feel almost like some of the detailing around the headdresses and stuff like that are almost more reminiscent of, indirectly, the actual, in finger brackets, forms of Nalthal that we now know, obviously.
Yeah, it is really interesting to me that they have them in veneration here. I guess maybe it shouldn't be, but Ul'dah has such specific reasons it ties itself to them, and while Sil'dih shares, I guess, many of those reasons, both of them dating back as far back as Mach in some ways, what with thaumaturgy and life and death, and I'm surprised that there isn't a Zima worship, especially with how closely it seems like Sil'dih follows after Beladia compared to, in some ways, Ul'dah. I don't say relinquishes that relationship, but it sometimes doesn't seem quite as stark.
Yeah, so that it's pretty significant for me. I really had assumed that Sil'dih would be, if not Azema, then some other god. It's a little strange to me that they seem to have both adopted the worship of Nalthal, because although, well, I shouldn't say adopted, because the scales are a present motif in Beladia. So clearly they were a secondary deity. They were worshipped in Beladia alongside Azema, below Azema specifically. But it's interesting that the twin rulers who went into civil war both worship the twins, and then their societies both worship the twins.
Huh. That is a really interesting point. And that also, I guess, there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of compelling symmetry there with that.
I think that's probably where it comes from, narratively speaking, like from a writing perspective.
Yeah, at the very least, there's a lot more compelling that way for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, we pick one of the Nald statues, and then we move on into the final little itty bitty section here with the warrior of the gladiator of Sil'dihn.
Yeah. What's this room called again? What's this room called in game?
It is called the something weird. It's like the Cornice of Favor.
Cornice of Favor. That's interesting.
Also, the treasure room is just called Prosperity, which is interesting. And the entire section is called the Hidden Halls.
Right. Cornice of Favor. I wonder if this had like a religious purpose, maybe?
Maybe. I don't even know what a cornice is now.
It's like a decorative ornamentation.
Huh.
It's like it's kind of like crown molding, which is not the best, but it's like a roof decoration, basically, a ceiling decoration.
I guess the impression there is because there's just a giant pedestal in the middle and it doesn't seem like for any specific person, it's just supposed to be decorative.
Yeah, decorative or religious, or maybe like a secret council room or something for important.
Well, okay. Also, the cornice specifically is the top part, the top flat part. So yeah, okay. If you look at it, the top section of this, top flat section of this, actually would fit into that definition.
Okay.
It's just a very interesting choice. I wonder if the Japanese name is a different thing, and they were like, okay, this is the best approximation we can come up with. I doubt it, because usually it's not that sort of thing. But
yeah, normally not, but it's definitely possible. I wonder if maybe there's slightly different cultural context, like if it's a temple, like something more associated with temples and their construction in Japanese culture. I wonder if there's some difference there.
Still plenty of grapevine imagery around, but also I want to ask, what do you think the rationale was for, because we didn't come in this way because we went through the prosperity chamber, but the mechanisms where you have to pull one of the levers and something falls into the pit, what do you think what was this for? What was any of this for?
So that's difficult to answer, because the section it just falls into is just like a plain floor level where there's nothing of real, it's not like a gladiatorial arena.
No.
And then it just leads down into what's trying to ape. It looks like just the general floor. So in the game, it just kind of leads down to a pit. But I'm assuming that just is supposed to connect to the wider floor below the cornice in sort of actual design. But there's nothing there.
I guess. Yeah. I guess don't worry about it. The whole thing's the whole thing is decorative.
We'll do what archaeologists do, and we don't know what to call it ceremonial.
But yeah, the gladiator of Sil'dihn. So we know that Sil'dihn had an association, a strong love for martial prowess, as well as for soulkin. And we know that from its description, I believe it is heavily stated, not even implied, I think outright stated to be based off of the vicegerents to the warden, the Karn boss. It's definitely an extension of that.
This is just a Belladine construction. I mean, I'm not just is too harsh a word, but it is explicitly the same kind of thing, just made out of metal.
Yeah, they specifically say that it is made using Belladine technology. So it's designed to excel at sword fighting. Although you say metal, I feel like, is the one in Karn not metal? Is it stone? I always thought it was like
stone,
bronze.
isn't it?
I always thought it was like supposed to be bronze.
Oh, it could be. You could be right. Hold on.
Just because that's very, be very Egyptian-y.
It is. You're right. It's sort of bronzy golden. Okay, it's like very Tutankhamun-y. Okay, scratch that statement then. But yeah. It's overtly silver, which fits in with and it's got purple on it as well. Its collar is purple, so it fits into it's a Sildihn interpretation of a Belladine. I don't want to say technology, but basically like a magical technology.
Yeah. There's also there's lots of things that Nanamo says as we go throughout, and some of it's useful, some of it's kind of just reaffirmed in notes or elsewhere, and I may even have missed a nice comment on that she made here or there. But one of the things she points out is Erlig's burial chamber. Technically, this is later on, but I just want to point out that she notes the Sildihn's veneration of the dead being not so disconnected from the Uldaz and the way in which they treat their dead. So maybe it does make sense, that veneration that they worship Nald'thal. Although, now that I think about it, when we get later on into the Eternal Ease, which is, I think, when she references that, I think the Eternal Ease would have been made by Ul'dah, because the forward operating camp and all of that, and Zarak would have been, so.
Or at least inhabited at certain points by Ul'dah, if not built by it.
For sure. So talking more about the gladiator in specific, he's got a lot of the whole grape motif. And it's kind of one of the first things that's way more silver specifically in design.
Yeah, so overtly silver with the purple underlights. And the head is different. It's less pharaonic. It's almost like Persian Hellenic type sort of situation.
Definitely. And I think it's supposed to evoke the Helm of Might, right? So then it both has the grapes and the helm together.
I think more overtly than even the statues, it looks exactly like the Helm of Might.
Yeah, although it does have that little top bit. But yeah, for the most part. I like this boss on a mechanical level, just to comment really quickly. I like the idea of paying attention to how much it charges up and then needing to swap. I like that whole thing. I also like that, for the most part, most of these bosses do teach you how to, if you play them in variant, it does give you some of the basics for playing them in Criterion, or at least kind of intuiting some of what the mechanics are going to do, if not how to solve them for Criterion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting process. It's very, very helpful. It helps, build up the skill level. And like I said earlier, that's something that 14 does do pretty well, I think.
So I think that about wraps up the second path. However, I just want to comment again. It's really interesting that, look, I know it's called the Sildihn Subterrain, but how underground and gloomy with the light this area feels when, in a technical sense, if you look at the elevations compared to each other, I mean, it's not really easy to compare, but if you kind of pay attention to how each one rises and falls, they don't really rise and fall that much. So it's interesting that it feels so much deeper underground in contrast to the more open skies of the left path.
Yeah, it sort of almost reminds me of Amdapor, which is, it feels like you're underground if you're in certain parts of the keep and certain parts of the keep, it just feels so boxed in and claustrophobic. I wonder how much of that is due to it being more intact, or how much of that is due to what we're sort of supposed to maybe not so directly into the elevations and stuff like that.
And gloomy light sure does help. But speaking of Amdapor, why don't we actually head into the third path? Because I think there's some interesting Amdapor, well, if not references, at least connections.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay. Moving into path 3, we get it immediately. It is mold and filth and webs and Man, I'm thinking of Amdapor right about now.
It definitely has that sort of impression, that Amdapori, like Earth Aether's been drained sort of vibe going onto it.
Yeah.
You know, I suppose that this can be linked to some of the themes of decay and stuff like that do crop up more often in this path than the other three.
Yeah, well, and it does make sense, right? It makes it distinct that you get the different kind of elements, the natural world bits and bobs, and the with the springs, passages, and groundwater. You have the more Soulkin and mechanical and technological, not industrial, but like societal side of the middle path, and then you have sort of the death and the fall and the sort of Ul'dan emulsion side with this path.
Yeah, it is almost like the left path is telling the story of modern Uldar, the middle path is telling the story of Sil'dihn, and then the right path is telling the story of the sort of the intersection between the two, and you know how violent that was.
Mm-hmm. I never even noticed this, but if you actually look down at the water as you enter in, you can see like literal filth and grime, and I'm gonna just assume antibiotic resistant poo floating on the water as it flows down endlessly.
Yeah, maybe my settling pool theory actually has some weight to it.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, but I think actually it really might. But moving right along through the mold-stricken nightmare land, we have the Wamura and Goosefish, which the Wamura might seem familiar as they are little moth vilekin that show up in Amdapor.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the Gredanians explicitly associate the Wilmora with filth. Like it's like a pestilential animal in their culture, even if that's not necessarily the reality of it, it's what they associate it with. So that's an interesting thing that they're here.
And I'll attempt to avoid doing this in general, but like just to read literally how they're described. The Wamora's distinct proboscis ends in a ring of hook-like teeth, which are used to latch onto and bore into the bloated bodies of recently slain creatures, so that the vilekin might drain the corpse of the foul liquids festering and fermenting within. Long have the people of Gridania despised the Wamorai, viewing the giant creature as portents of blight and disaster. In its wingless larval state, the Wamora is known as Wamora campa. So, fun.
Delightful, like a lamprey moth.
But I guess that goes along with the death and decay stuff, right? Like the idea that the creatures that are feasting on that death and decay, which I guess makes sense here, right? Because even if you take out the Sildihn undead, there's also the Ul'dan and the emulsion who would have died. So plenty of death and decay that would have ended up in this area.
Right, absolutely. And I mean, we will encounter that pretty directly in the case of the Emulsia going forward.
Yep. Further in, we have Gigantitoads, slugs. Kind of makes sense why they would end up here with, just the water environment and wavekin. And not much to say there. So further along, we get to what I think is one of the more interesting... I don't know why, but this is the thing that I just really caught my attention when I first did Sildihn Subterrain. Maybe because I was thinking about how there was a lack of dead, but that is that there is a void scent here, and it's a Hecdize. And I know I literally just said I wasn't going to read the description for each of these, but I want to do this real quick. Okay. Hecdize appear to be one of few void scent capable of reproduction on this plane, as new formations have been documented growing from discarded eyes. So the fact that one exists here on this plane, and naturally, especially when there's been no voidal magics used for summoning, makes me think that this Hecdi came about just from astrality and decaying eyes.
I absolutely think that's true. And when we see the Trader's Spurn, for example, it's always obviously it's thematically dark and it's sort of dark in practicality, but there's it's always sort of associated with dark magics as well. So I wonder if maybe that has some effect on swinging polarity as well.
Yeah. But the other creature is the Morbol, or, well, technically it's called, what, an Emeritat or something like that?
Yes, the Emeritat.
And I believe you have some comments on that.
Yeah, so the Emeritat is an interesting thing. It's Zoroastrian, so sort of harkening back to that Persian stuff that we were discussing for Daladaya Sildi. And it's interesting, it's the sort of embodiment. God isn't quite the right word, but in some traditions it is sort of worship, but it's the embodiment and the personification of immortality and of longevity, which is kind of the opposite of what's happening here.
Well, I mean, death and decay is a part of the cycle.
Yeah, and I guess if you're undead, you live forever.
Yeah. Well, look, it's not the first time that Final Fantasy hasn't played very fast and loose within what an incarnation of something was in a mythology.
Yeah, that's true. But it is definitely interesting. It's, maybe more an allusion to the Persian aspect of these cultures than it is to anything else.
If you look around into the architecture around here, some of it looks like everything else has so far, but we also have a lot of ladders that kind of just lead up to nowhere. And I'm like, were they supposed to be access ladders? Like, what were they?
The These corridors look familiar to me. I wonder if they're a modified version of the corridors that Thancred runs through in some of the cutscenes.
That would be interesting. I also do love that you can see some of the changed working. Again, that reminds me of sort of that Nimian seeing mechanisms in the background working.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Moving into the settling basin, we get where all the poo water settles. And now, from now on, I'm going to make sure I never get hit by the water attacks in here because,
Yeah, you don't want that. You definitely do not want that.
Speaking of antibiotics. But yeah, we fight Geryon here one last time. And he tries to hit you with poo water. Otherwise, it's the same with his exploding barrels. Do you think the exploding barrels are a concept? Like, is that how the Hecaton Kyries broke out of Copperbell?
Yeah, it's definitely supposed to sort of mimic the mining explosives that we see all throughout Copperbell. I think he probably bought them from Copperbell.
Mm-hmm. I also do think that the reworked Copperbell has a little bit more in line. The fights are a little bit more in line with this with Geryon.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think that's always been there, even in the old version, but I do see it more so overtly now.
Okay, moving past that, we break into a larger chamber with light streaming down and... Okay, yet another... Every time that they put light in an area in here, it's pretty stark. But it also gives you a really sense of both how far you are underground and also kind of how not far you are underground.
Yes.
Just by the fact of, like, you're pretty close. You're not, like, that far beneath. Like, hell, Halatali is deeper down in some ways. Well, parts of it.
It's interesting you mentioned Halatali, because that is explicitly where this architecture is from. The sort of windows and stuff built into the walls, that is Halatalian era architecture. I mean, I don't know if that's directly where it is, but it's probably more, sort of military and martial in aspect of just general Thanalanian culture.
Well, that makes sense if you think about where the Sand Gate and the Amalja encampment there, and the fact that it turns out, and we find this from the notes, that Zaharak is the area in Thanalan was created by the Ul'Dan as an operating camp for them, and this was a forward operating base here to help them fight the undead in Sil'dihn.
So the law with Zaharak is interesting as well, because we should note that on top of it being a forward operating base, it is also a location that is important to the religiosity of the Amalja, which is sort of implied to be, an older tradition.
Yeah, both Zanrak and Zaharak.
Yeah, but yeah, these are structures from Halatali. So whether that is a reflection of the military culture of Ul'Dah, or whether it is, something else entirely, I think is interesting to see.
Well, we know Halatali was also built up over periods of time too, so it wouldn't be the craziest thing if Thorne had put some installations in there, especially if after working on places like Copperbell.
That's possible. I think, yeah, maybe I'd have to look up at the dates, but it's entirely possible that they were doing some stuff in Halatali.
Most of the enemies are nothing to write home about, either Gelkin, like the Drakes. Although, okay, I will say one thing. That Drake puzzle, I mean, look, it's not that hard once you know it, but and you notice that okay, there are 5 different sizes. That's weird. But here's my one problem with the Drake puzzle for figuring out for the secret path. You don't know whether you need to count up or count down. There's no indication do you need to kill biggest to smallest or smallest to biggest.
Right, yeah, it's it took me a little while, I'll be honest, on my first run through.
Yeah.
It's been a while since I did that, but yeah. Of course, the Drakes are the domesticated beasts of the Amalja, and they feature into their religion and culture pretty profoundly, so it makes sense that we would find them here from a lore perspective.
Mm-hmm. I do love all the Amaljan little bits and bobs all around, though, too. You see an Amaljan sigil, and you'll see it next to a Sildihn shield, or you'll or an Ul'Dan shield, or I just love all the little bits of storytelling going on here. I also love that if you look down, you can see really fast moving waters and churning waters, and it makes me think of, are these waters connected into somewhere in Eastern Thanalan, because especially the right path would be going more east. Does it connect into something like the Ugram River, which falls off into the river next to the Burning Wall? Is that where this source of water is coming from?
I think, yeah, that would make sense to me.
Yeah, it's just a very... it's very easy to skip over some of the details in this chamber just because you're staring kind of right ahead and you're also near the end. But you can also see Sildihn water carrying pipes as well down there.
Yeah, almost more of an indication that there was sort of a wider system that tapped into sort of wider spread sources, or carried it to surrounding villages, maybe even.
It's so wild to me that It feels like Sildihn has more infrastructure for carrying water than it does for any populace. Which, like, I get it. Lots of its places are in ruin, and also, I realize it's also the game's willing to concede that it like can't do everything, and it can't like here the same way that you don't see all the hundreds of thousands of people that are supposed to live in Ul'dah, because the just games can't do that in scale and scope and size. But it's just interesting that the architecture of the water feels appropriate, maybe, but not maybe the same scale and scope to the population density.
Yeah, I suppose that we're supposed to take the we're supposed to maybe assume that some of the infrastructure that we see in Ul'dah is just Sil'dihn infrastructure that's been like civilian infrastructure that's been rebuilt upon. But yeah, I can't demand more Sil'dihn content after we already got all this. But I'm always up to see some more stuff.
Yeah, I'm just willing to like say too that like sometimes the scales are just not going to be correct in scope. Like they're just not going to match up.
Yeah.
Okay. Heading into the third fight, we've got a door that asks us a question, and it's a lore-based question, and I love it when they freaking do this. For me, I'm sure some people find it annoying, but it asks you basically what Amalja were brought into the world with, and it's the Sacred Flame, I believe. And I love that because it's in an Encyclopedia Eorzean Volume 1. It's also, if you've done like the tribe quest and anywhere else, it exists in many different places. But I wish there was more like lore trivia.
I think this is a good one as well, because you could surmise this without knowing, but just by knowing what the Amalja are sort of vaguely about.
Yeah. I think the other one was like the Spark of Creation or something.
Yeah.
Moving on in, we get to a giant coffin, and I also find it hysterical that this coffin is just a Amaljan chest. This is like the chest you get after you beat Ifrit, but scaled. It's like squashed and scaled.
It works, honestly.
It does. It works really, really well. But this is kind of what I was talking about earlier about the veneration of the dead. And so if this structure was built by the Ul'dah, it kind of furthers that Ul'dah has a very specific association and connection with making sure the dead are venerated.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting to see like a combined burial site, like Ul'dah and Amaljan, like architecture and refinement put together.
Mm-hmm. I also do appreciate that this like fight doesn't even happen unless you disturb the coffin, and I realize it's part of like getting to the final end, the secret ending, because that seems appropriate that that our little friend would not necessarily wake up and get angry until you messed with him.
Yeah, and one of the notes describes the method that you can go through. I think from talking with Nanamo pulls aside the Amalja representative to Ul'dah and like asks him what they would do if they somehow mysteriously, devoid of context, found a giant Amalja coffin. And he's like, "Oh, you should just."
And he gives you the instructions.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so good. Oh, also, I forgot to mention the earlier section is known as the Flames Fork. But speaking of veneration of the dead, this area is called the Traitor. Well, this is technically called Eternal Ease, but the broader area is called the Traitor's Return. So makes going with Nal Thal, literally the Traitor's Return, the returning to the Traitor so that they can weigh your soul.
Yes.
On the scales.
Yeah, absolutely. It's they have definitely put so much thought into the world building in this very dungeon, which is, I know, the point of it, but it's really really appreciated 100%.
Yeah. So we get into our fight with Shadowcaster Zilesgal. Oh, sorry. So we get into our fight with Shadowcaster Zilesgal.
Yeah, it's an interesting fight with an absolutely enormous Amaljan zombie. He looks awesome.
Yeah, it does look awesome. Were you expecting that for the final fight? Because I guess not the final fight, but this fight. Because when I was like, this is amazing, this is cool, this is appropriate, and also
Yeah, I wasn't expecting it. I was expecting like to fight like an Ul'dah captain or like a Sildihn captain that was as a zombie, and they'd probably like alter the Ishgardian zombies model from Hard. Oh no, just from the second whatever it's called. But the ice zombies, just like remold them.
Yeah.
But no, they
went the Dust Vigil.
Yes, Dust Vigil. But no, they made a full new Amalja zombie model. It looks awesome.
It does. And also because, look, the story of the series so far, but especially into Shadowbringers and especially into Endwalker, has been about kind of the reconnecting of the tribal groups with all the Eorzeans and trying to fix old wounds and move forward. The fact that they're honored, like the Amalja are given this rather than it just being a random Sildihn captain or something, I think actually works better, especially when one of the big elements of even the Sildihn Subterrain is kind of is about not forgetting these past, not forgetting their sacrifices, not forgetting that the Emulsia, literally even this guy the whole time, he's like, this guy's so far gone, he thinks you're corrupted by the traitor's spurn, but he was willing to die fighting by his allies, to cleanse the land of the danger.
Yeah. And another good lore note that they keep consistent is that Gar is the title for warriors.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually not a commander's rank, so it's interesting that he probably didn't command this conflict. He was just a particularly noted warrior in it, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. I also love that you get the Shadowcaster, you get all his magics and flames, but he's also a combatant.
Yeah, it feels true to the Emulsion culture where mages would logically, although we know that mages, thaumaturges specifically exist, and maybe conjurers, but that they would also be capable of fighting. There isn't a mage caste. There's a warrior caste, and then the mages in that are probably warrior mages.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it is worth pointing out that this Triple Triad card, he specifically voluntarily joined the Ul'dah efforts. And this was the thing I referenced earlier, but he was wounded in the course of protecting an ally and subsequently turned into the very thing he sought to vanquish, which is interesting that his wound was enough to carry the curse of the traitor's spurn. It is interesting that it was communicable to that degree.
Yeah, we're on like Walking Dead rules here, where a scratch can sort of convey it as well as just like a bite or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, that about wraps up Route 3. Are you ready for our fourth and final secret fight?
You bet I am.
So we head on right behind that rightmost route, and we find a bunch of cannons and a mammoth. Well, actually, not a mammoth, but we have the Thorne Knight, which, by his description, is actually not a mammoth, but is actually a Sul'dihn. Which I'm so thankful they put that in there for his lore bit. In fact, I'm just going to read it real quick. Like, this arcane soldier was created during the Thorne Dynasty to combat the plague of undead. Of its 4 arms, 2 belong to a fallen Emulsia warrior, which was incorporated to enhance its affinity with fire. Despite its mammoth-like appearance, the use of thaumaturgy in its creation means it's more akin to a golem than a mechanical construct. That helps a lot because mammoths weren't, like, forgekin weren't really a thing at the time very much in lore. So its capacity, its strength, its power, and the fact that it exists at all makes much more sense if it's at least part golem or more soulkin than forgekin.
And I gotta say, Thorne Dynasty, I'm not 100% sure about putting the arms of an Emulsia warrior on your golem. That feels a little bit disrespectful, but go ahead, I guess.
I mean, maybe it's a symbol of the compact of their all of them fighting together. Maybe it's a symbol of their unity.
The fact that it comes straight after a section where you can choose to respect the dead by leaving them alone, it just feels...
Yeah, maybe that's a really good point. Oops. Oopsie doopsie. Thorne did another war crime.
It's a cool model, though. The mammoth, well, not a mammoth, the knight looks awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool. Very fun fight. And then moving right past it, we get into the ultimate point of this story, which is the treasure chamber, I guess. I don't know even what we would necessarily call it, but the final treasure chamber where Thorne kept their emulsion and some of their relics, as well as the Sultanate, members of the Ul line, kept many of their goods.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's there's some pretty cool things in here. So a lot of it is just sort of like stuff we've seen before. There's the torches, there's the weird 2-headed turtle that shows up, like, I think that also shows up in Belladine, maybe.
It also shows up in the Sultanate throne room.
Yeah, that's right. That's where I always see it. It somehow just lodged itself in my brain after a brief sight. I was like, oh, look at that cool tortoise. But like the book is like a unique model as well that has some pictures of some of the stuff that's in. I think it's unique.
Yeah, what's interesting is it has pictures of some of these stuff that it also looks like it has... Oh, no, that's just the horn from the right side. I noticed this the first time. If you look around the room, it goes Ul'dah flag, emulsion symbol, Ul'dah flag, like and repeat. But if you look, the left side of the room is all relics of Ul'dah, and the right side's all relics of Emulsia. So
Yes.
it's like it's specifically showing that veneration in equal measure.
But yeah, this is an interesting room. I guess it's like a war memorial, essentially, but not one that not anyone was ever intended to go and see.
Well, I mean, it's a war memorial, but it's also, I mean, literally they have the line that they wrote, right? Like literally the Thorne and the Emulsia wrote, "For coin, country, and comrades in arms, we bequeath this trust to the House of Ul." The idea is that it is supposed to be a specific statement about their unity and about their capacity to work together, in staunch contradiction to what people like the Monetarists and the Syndicate have done in order to other the tribal groups into other the Amalja, like as we find them at the beginning of A Realm Reborn.
Yeah, it does feel like the Thorne Dynasty is getting a little worried that if they give the power back to the Yule, which of course they do pretty soon after this, they're worried that maybe they'll do another little war crown or something.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, and that's ultimately kind of the real focus of Sildihn Subterrain in some ways, is Nanamo's being able to have some catharsis around her parents, and also kind of a statement that her parents were good, because really before Sildihn Subterrain, the fact that her father would have acquiesced to the laws that were enforced about the tribal groups and they're being kicked out of Ul'dah made him like a more ambiguous figure. It's like, well, why did he allow that to happen? But it's clear that he planned to fight back against it, which I'm torn on. Because on the one hand, I like that. I think it works. It makes sense. I'm with it. But also, I don't want all the good guys to just be good, uncomplicatedly good.
Yeah, I agree. It's a little bit strange, some of the writing around Ul'dah. It's maybe a little bit uniquely Japanese in that it is so defensive of. I don't know if that's 100% the right term, but it's almost defensive of the monarchy as a sort of a correct choice as opposed to a bureaucracy, or well, I suppose more accurately an oligarchy, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think honestly where it comes from, because I mean, think about it. We do, I think we do that sometimes. Is that with Western culture and princes and warriors and knights and stuff. I think part of it comes from a place of just we like Nanamo, we like this character. We see them do good thing, they do good things. Since they be good, they should be in position of power. And so because she's also a monarch, it inherently defends the monarchy because of it.
I mean, she is textually attempting to form a republic, so I guess there's that as well.
Yeah, I mean, she literally she almost was assassinated because she tried to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And she's still gonna try and do that. She's just taking it slow.
Yeah, she realized that she can't cause change to happen overnight or won't be accepted. If you want change, you have to change thought. You can't just legalize. You can't just make things law and expect everyone to change. You have to change how people are thinking about things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, that about gets all of it. I mean, beyond that, there's really just the notes from the book, which I mean, honestly, the most of the notes at this point we've covered over. Yeah, the only thing I guess I just wanted to point out, because I don't think we talked about much in the Malachite Portico, was Nashasite, which is the gem that is a deep green or a bright green that looks like Nanamo's mother's eyes. And I just love that because that was the lore at least in 2.0. I don't know if it was in 1.0, but it was in 2.0. And so I love that they're taking like little bits of history like that and bits and bobs of lore that they created really early on and making sure to interweave it in. And I feel like variant dungeons have been wildly successful as a format for making sure to weave in everything, like not everything, that's not true, but many of the things that could possibly be relevant for the lore that have already existed and weave in new things at the same time. And I think that makes them a great format.
Yeah, I agree. I think they've delivered, especially. I'm a little bit fonder, like I said earlier, of the Sildihn Subterrain than I am of Mount Rakan. But I think they both do a pretty good job of it. But I think Sildihn delivers on its sort of aims, as we've interpreted them at least, really successfully.
Yeah. Speaking of that, we're going to make sure to do a Mount Rokon and an Alo Alo variant dungeon video before too long for sure.
Yes, we are. Absolutely, we are.
All right, then. Wrapping up that, well, I guess there's no last things to say other than look forward to more stuff like this. I'll continue working on other regular videos. Currently, we do a lot of streaming over on T Live, where I've either been streaming, replaying non-MSQ stuff on Elio, starting to stream Final Fantasy 11, or I stream working on some of the videos while I work on them. And also me and Naniri stream every Thursday. We're replaying all the Final Fantasy games.
Hell yeah. Keep your eye on our Discord for announcements regarding the timing of that.
Yeah. If you want to support us, well, first off, you can go check out some of the other channels like T Live, where we stream, or Final Fantasy 14 Archive, where Ray puts up videos that are incredibly high quality archived versions of events that have only a limited time before they go away. So, for instance, Fall Guys or old Halloween events. She's also doing some more permanent, but things that other people don't get to, like the Alliance Tribal Quests. Beyond that, you can support us by going over to our Patreon, tossing a couple dollars. You get your name in the credits as well as in our banner during streams. And also, you can just check out our other videos. You can share them around, like, comment, yada yada, all the YouTube goodness.
Heck yeah, it's worth a watch. Elio does some fantastic stuff with music if you like that.
Thank you very much. Any final words or thoughts on it, my friend?
I think this is an absolutely fantastic and very ambitious but very successful attempt at creating a certain kind of content.
Yes, and I'm definitely looking forward to the future. Okay, well then, I've been Elio Forcheron.
And I've been a Neri.
Take care, everyone.
Hey all, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, praise the 12 by giving it a like and comment, or by subscribing. It goes a long way to helping the channel. Don't forget, new videos every week, and if you want to engage with us further, why not check out our Discord and Patreon in the link below and become a part of our community. With that said, see you around, fellow archons.